the design of this technology, but also, as importantly, the implementation of this technology. You can overcome this using early planning and engagement. And when we say early planning, we mean at the conceptual phase of design. We need to be thinking about how does this integrate into the wider healthcare systems. But I think it's important to also recognise that there is a genuine growth of digital therapies now, particularly within NHS Scotland. Just now, as you can see from our little graph here, we have round about 22,000 referrals a year. So this is referrals for CBT treatment into our computerized CBT services. And actually this accounts, more importantly, for about 1 in 5 of all referrals to psychological therapies. So that means every time 5 referrals is made, at least one of those will be to a computerized automated program. And I think equal to this, though, is the potential for growth in these services. So we're now predicting that the figure will increase to about 30,000 in the next 8 or 9 months. And actually the longer term projections is well over 50,000 referrals per annum. So this would become a huge service within our mental health landscape in Scotland. But it's also worth mentioning that other technologies are also beginning to be picked up. And in actual fact, our video-enabled therapy, which is therapy delivered through VC, has about 4,000 consultations per week. So that's just over 200,000 sessions of therapy are being delivered per year through our video conference service. So there's a huge growth and a huge potential here. And I think what I've seen, certainly in my 15 or 16 years or so working in this field, is a real shift in the last 4 or 5 years where technology has become really a priority of the majority of governments looking at how to address mental health moving forward. I think the second thing, which is very, very important, is developing the understanding. And I think we all that have been involved in design will understand the principles of developing a coherent idea of what needs to be achieved within the technology. But I think there's also an aspect where it has to be, a level of understanding has to be developed around the systems that you're deploying the technologies. So one of the aspects would be organizational confidence. So if you have a piece of technology, how do you then sell that to large healthcare structures who can then have organizational confidence that this technology is going to do the job that you're saying it can? And this comes across in many ways. So you also have clinical recommendation. So do you have a clinician's backing as to what the technology is? Participation and equality, is it inclusive across the demographics of the population? Is it interoperability in relation to connectivity into existing systems? Is it secure? And what would happen to the organization's reputation if it goes wrong? Now, these are very, very important aspects in relation to design, because you're thinking about how you're designing, but also in relation to engagement during the design process. I think it's important to be aware there's a number of governance barriers. So there's clinical governance, information, IT standards, and cybersecurity. Again, all of these will have to be met, particularly around information governance, and information governance standards may be different in different countries. So you need to develop an understanding of what is required around this. And then when you're designing the systems, designing it in such a way that you know that there will be a level of compliance. And I think the last one, particularly within health settings, is clinical acceptance. This is by far, I think, the biggest barrier to actually deploying at scale technologically enabled care. I think when you consider mental health, you have to consider the tradition within the clinical settings. I think when we are looking to deploy a computer program which does a CBT treatment, we are very aware that we're actually competing against probably 100 years of tradition in relation to clinical practice. So there needs to be an extensive program of clinical engagement, evaluation, and the development of appropriate evidence. And I think you can genuinely achieve clinical acceptance through peer engagement and a strategic approach to marketing, which I'll come back to later on in the presentation. I think the third kind of key thing that you need to consider is service. And this is about placing the design in the context of the mental health service or structure that you're developing. To make a successful service, you have to build common goals, be efficient in terms of delivery. There needs to be good communication and marketing. There has to be access to clinical advice and support. You need the clinical buy-in, local and national coordination, transparency, patient engagement, and strategic alignment to national profile or policy. In addition to that, I think it's very, very important that you're considering the service model of deployment. So how will this work in the real world? If it is a treatment, obviously it has to have various layers of governance built in. If it's about research, again, it has to have the levels of governance built around that. And I think it's really important that what you're doing is you're building the service structures to allow the technology to do its job. And that's what's very, very important about this. Again, what the temptation is within healthcare is you get a piece of technology and then you wrap it in a clinical bubble. So you'll be wrapping things like computerized CBT around with assessments and exit interviews and all sorts of other things for patients because people do not trust the technology. So you have to develop trust in the technology, but then build the structures within the service model that allows you to allow the technology to do its job. In addition to that, I think if you do spend a wee bit of time thinking about the service model, what you can actually achieve is a service delivery platform. And this is a relatively crude idea, but effectively what you're able to do is you're able to build a way of delivering the technology to patients within a healthcare, which then allows you to build in multiple technologies within that one service structure. So that would effectively mean that clinical governance, for example, could be achieved for multiple different products or for multiple different technologies using the existing structure. And what this really does is it massively reduces implementation time. So as an example, within Scotland, we were in the process of an implementation program for CCBT. The first iteration took 2 years to get through all the governance and all the structures that we had to build. The next iteration took about 5 months to achieve the same goal. The most recent iteration has taken 6 weeks. So you're actually in a position where a national deployment of technology begins to catch up with the speed of development for the technologies that you're employing. Another aspect of this is then how do you integrate the digital service or the technology into clinical models of service. This is a step care model, which basically just highlights the different levels of severity versus the population, the wider aspect of the triangle being the biggest population. And what we have in Scotland is we now have technologies distributed across the step care model, which allow people to access either digital service, which is delivering treatments and relatively standalone as pieces of technology, or enhancing existing service by either providing greater access through video enabled therapy, or actually using different modes of delivery, such as our internet enabled CBT service, which is CBT delivered by written communication via web browser. One of the other kind of key aspects I think that we should all be considering at the beginning of any design process is really the partnerships that you're building. And the partnerships are not necessarily about the innovation, but actually about moving from innovation to mainstream service. This is an example of a partnership network that I currently work in. So you can see here we have government policymakers, national meetings and groups. We have our NHS health boards, our psychology heads of service, but we also have a whole range of other individuals involved in this. All of these groups were engaged prior to the design of the service or the technology. So that means that our government policymakers will have sight of the piece of technology that's being developed potentially years before it's actually deployed. And again, this is really highlighted through the importance of co-design, and we use the term co-design a lot within health and care settings, but without really understanding what it means. And in this context, co-design means a long-term partnership, which then creates ownership and buy-in in the technology that you're developing, helps develop a long-term vision, as well as the route to large-scale deployment, and actually then allows you to develop innovative products and technologies which genuinely address the gaps within service or market. And this is very, very important because there's lots of innovation programs that exist globally around the world that are developing really intuitive, very intelligent pieces of technology. But the reality is when you try to apply it into the appropriate health and care setting, it is just not doing the job that it needs to do. So it's very, very important that what we're doing at the beginning of the design process is engaging, creating the partnership network, and using that partnership network then to guide and shape what we're doing over the longer term. And again, important aspects about the partnership that you're creating is developing common goals and aims. So the ability to articulate what you're trying to achieve and the ability to communicate that is very, very important. You need to spend a wee bit of time learning about your partners, developing a clear understanding of needs, understand what restricts or limits your partners, particularly if you're dealing with clinicians. They have a very, very busy schedule, very difficult to get a genuine amount of time with them. You have to be responsive and reactive, build the trust through transparency, and share knowledge and learn together. So it's just like a marriage, effectively. So you just need to be thinking a wee bit about how you're building that partnership. Most important really is a trust built through transparency, I would say. As I said before, one of the biggest barriers is clinical acceptance. This tends to be something that's thought about post-development. But actually the reality is there's big steps you can take during the development and design process to actually begin to get that clinical acceptance within health and care. I think it's very important that you're building evidence. So evidence is by far one of the most powerful things that we can have within digital mental health to then support what we're trying to achieve. And I think it's very, very important that what we're doing at every stage is building the evidence that supports the claims of the technology. Whether that's around the technical architecture of the system, the satisfaction of the users, safety, effectiveness, or even the conclusions that machine learning might come to. We have to be aware that, again, you're fighting against this 100 years of tradition. Clinical practice has been the same for a long time. You're beginning to make changes, and I think AI in particular has the potential to make huge changes within mental health. It's therefore very, very important that what we're doing is we're building the evidence as we progress. And this evidence should be research focused, but also demonstrate at scale how the technology would work. So again, small tests of change that cost lots of money are great to get proof of concept, but when you're moving that product into a wider implementation, you have to be aware that you'll have to prove that before people spend money on it. And I think you need to be thinking about this in relation to how to build this evidence across all phases of design and development. In addition to that, I think there's also a real need to think about marketing and continual communication. Now, when I'm talking about marketing, I'm not talking about nice leaflets and nice flyers or adverts on television or adverts in newspapers. What we're talking about is structured communication that will then shape opinion and address negative perceptions. And one of the biggest barriers that I come across in my daily activity is preconceived ideas of what technology can do within mental health, which are not founded on any real fact or reality of the situation. And in fact, I can quote many, many times where I've sat in front of clinicians and they've told me that CCBT won't work, but actually the reality is they've never seen CCBT. So it's important that you're addressing those negative perceptions through continued marketing. You have to have a consistent message, preventing confusion, creating clarity, and also has to be strategic, continual, and well-timed. The only caveat to this is you're creating expectation, and therefore you need to meet that expectation. In terms of messages and how you shape that opinion, you can have strong clinical evidence, needs, ease effectiveness, research, the alignment to national target, or alignment to national strategies, for example. And that's about finding the right levers, which can then help the conversation or the argument that you're presenting. In addition to that, you also have to be aware of the negative perceptions around whatever you're developing. And again, a lot of people have negative perceptions about what AI is and is not able to do. And this might include things like dropout rates, it's not safe, there's program difficulties, replacing existing services, it's not accurate, or there's lack of evidence. And I think, again, just to reiterate, I think, again, marketing, as with evidence, is something which happens continually through the design process. And if you have phases of design, then it's about aligning your marketing in such a way that you can look at the impact of this marketing and systematically expand it across each of those phases. last couple of slides. One of the remits of this presentation was to think a wee bit about what AI could do in this context. I strongly believe that AI machine learning will be the future of healthcare. I think we've already seen strong evidence of diagnosis through AI and machine learning systems. We know that AI chatbots in particular really engage with younger people and can be really used to reach out to individuals. And we also have really good examples of machine learning which are providing a huge additional insight into what influences people's mental health, both in an environmental state, a genetic state, but also in relation to people's patterns of behaviors. And I think a really good example of this is a company within the UK which is looking at depression and has actually identified 7 different types of depression that they come across in their daily work, each of them with slightly different requirements around treatment. So again, the treatment is really beginning to improve at the point of delivery. And what we're able to do with machine learning now is actually begin to integrate it into the real-time delivery of therapy, making sure that our therapists are delivering the best possible treatment in the best possible circumstances. I think what we're able to do in addition to that is if we have AI as a standalone entity, we are able to now begin to develop systems which can provide dynamic, adaptive and responsive systems to patient requirements, as well as remaining patient-centered. And I think the criticism of existing systems would be that they're very linear and require a little bit more intelligence. We can provide greater support at the point of crisis, but we also can use AI to support and prevent mental health at population levels. And I think I would really strongly say that I believe that AI will be the next generation of technologies, but it also could be a significant turning point in the ongoing battle against mental health. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Let me encourage everyone who is listening to send in questions through the Q&A button. And in the meantime, Chris, there were a few things that you were speaking to that that caught my attention. I'd love to chat with you a little bit more about that. One statistic that was really remarkable was the reduction in duration of adoption from 2 years to, you said, perhaps 6 months to or 3 months to 6 weeks. And I'm curious, or I guess perhaps many of us are curious when we think about being system designers, why is the time to deployment going down? Is there a particular, is it a human-to-human friction point that has been reduced, that once reduced is reduced for all future technologies, or is it something? We'd love to hear more about that.
I think it's about, so what we've done within our CCVT service and other digital services is build the structures. So within health and care, there are very deliberate structures around clinical governance, very deliberate structures around evaluation, and very deliberate structures around staff expertise. So the reality is, when we actually look at our services, the last thing we think about is technology, which sounds a bit funny, but what we need to be able to do is get to a position where we can interchange technologies or add to the existing services without having to recreate those services multiple times. So what tends to happen within healthcare is you tend to have a bit of innovation which is being developed. The innovation tends to be developed in isolation, perhaps with 1 or 2 clinicians involved. When you bring it into the wider system, you find that you have to then build the service around that piece of technology to get all the different aspects in. Because you have to do that, then you're starting again in relation to clinical governance structures, in relation to persuasion of clinicians, clinical acceptance, everything that goes into it. And what actually we've done is by creating service platforms, which have these bits built in, but slightly separate technology, it then allows you to then systematically increase the number of products, or in this case, treatments, without changing that service structure. And that's by far the hardest part. So the 2 years it takes me to deploy is not getting the technology installed onto the systems, it's building everything else around about it. So what we're able to do by using this idea of a service platform, you can then go through an iterative process by deploying additional technologies into there. And actually what happens is that you go through a massive reduction, because the expertise and skills built into the service as is all the complicated structure. So what we've seen very clearly is now we're going through national deployments in weeks, not years or months.
That's very promising to hear. One other thing that came to mind while listening to you was, and you spoke to this, you spoke to your observation that there are a lot of younger people who are adopting chatbots, perhaps as a way to interact with some of the pressures they face uniquely. And we know that there is a disproportionate seeding of these problems at that age of our life. Now, chatbots for teenagers, let's say, are probably one of the farthest things away from clinical acceptance in terms of the release cycles of chatbots and the acceptance cycles on the clinical side. And at the same time, there's an undeniable need to experiment with these things. So some of the companies, as we know in the world, are using consumer products that are designed to eventually create a pathway to clinical acceptance, to put out consumer products as a test bed for various clinical research practices. Are you seeing this from your purview and your perch, and how might somebody who's building those technologies think about doing that? It would be great to hear a perspective from the Scottish government's experiments and so on.
So I mean, I think innovation is now a very different thing in Scotland, where innovation is now considered to be part of the mainstream as opposed to something on the side. So that's really, really encouraging. I think you'll still come across the same issues around clinical acceptance, which is that the technology is new, there's not a lot of evidence base for it, it's not proven to work. But I do think there's ways to overcome that. I think what you need to be thinking about, particularly depending what the technology is what is the theoretical basis for the technology? So is the theoretical basis around a specific psychological therapy type, like CBT, for example, or mindfulness, or solution-focused therapy, which is another interesting one. What is the clinical involvement in the development of the system and product? But I think the best thing that you could do is begin to layer in the evidence creation, as I said, within that. If you have evidence that it works, and the evidence doesn't have to be too arduous at the beginning stages, what you're trying to get to a position where is if you have a technology where people can begin to recognize the sound theoretical basis that it's developed on, but also then if you're developing new technologies, then you're actually able to prove how those new technologies are engaging with the service users or the patients in this case. So it's about being very clear, I suppose, from the beginning, what do you need to do to then evidence the technology that you're developing in the appropriate context, if that makes sense.
So just to tease that and pull on that thread a little bit more, here's a question from Dave Morbett. He asks, he's interested in knowing, I think a lot of us are, to understand what kind of evidence would clinicians find compelling in this context, because they're used to a certain paradigm. And as you said, some of the things that might make them open to listening to new paradigms is that something looks different, something looks more compelling. So could you expand a bit on what kind of evidence you have seen as being convincing for clinicians when it comes to tech efficacy?
Yeah, so we have about 3 or 4 different levels of evidence that we look at. So the gold standard is integration into clinical guidance. So we have clinical guidelines for different condition groups. If you can get your technology integrated into that, that's the gold standard, because that's what clinicians are supposed to be working from. I think it's important to realize that that is not specific to different, to individual pieces of technology or product, but maybe generic to things like computerized CBT, for example. Underneath that, then you'd obviously have things like randomized controlled trials, which again is a very clinical structure. But obviously it's incredibly expensive and very time consuming and doesn't really fit, I don't think, within the kind of technological sphere. Underneath that, what you're looking for is a sound theoretical basis. So for example, if you're developing interactive chatbots for teens, is it CBT based, which is where the evidence lies as to being the most appropriate therapy for that individual group? Or is it some other type of therapy-based system? So it's important that what you're able to do is you're able to evidence during the design process what has guided that process of design. So what is the clinical theoretical basis that it's been built on, and being able to evidence that within the product that you're developing. So that sounds complicated, but actually the reality is things like CCBT, for example, you have principles of CBT delivery and principles of CBT treatment, which are quite easy to research and understand. And all to look at is the different structures around thoughts, challenging thoughts, et cetera, et cetera. So then the kind of lower level would be if it's about a different piece of technology, it's then about evidencing the outcome. So if it's machine learning, for example, it's being able to marry up what the machine learning outcome would be within a research basis, I think.
And Chris, to close the session, let me relay a question from Martha Russell. She is speaking to she's reacting to the system perspective that you offered and the scope of service platforms and service design that you described. And the question is, how do you envision adjacent or supporting diagnostic treatment roles to get extended beyond health professions to other specializations or fields? And how might we think about personal identity in this integrated service paradigm?
Well, that's a big question. Okay, sorry, could you just read that one more time? There was a lot to that question.
Yeah, I think the question, perhaps my understanding of it, is that as new technologies comes into our service ecosystem, do we envision expanding the supporting diagnostic and treatment roles beyond the health profession to other specializations and fields?
Okay. Yeah, so I suppose I think absolutely. I think the reality is, again, particularly if you're in a position where you have an AI supported system, for example, or a machine learning system, which then you have a certain degree of accuracy around diagnosis, then obviously you'll be in a position where you can change the professionals involved in that conversation. I think it's quite far off, but I think the reality is in the near future, I don't know how long it'll be, you'll be in a very different situation with GPs, for example, where you have X% of GP diagnosis being done through separate systems, which with less intensive professionals working in those areas. So I think it absolutely will change. I think we're already noticing within mental health, there's changes to the makeup of the professional services, the clinical services. So now no longer is just things like clinical psychologists and CBT therapists. You now have digital specialists in there. You now have guided self-help workers, a whole range of different people as we begin to develop the technologies around those services. I think how the technology begins to interact and become successful within mental health, within the wider health and care system, is absolutely fundamental to what the changes will be and how it evolves longer term. And I think for me, there'll be an absolute shift in the roles that exist within healthcare. There can't not be. Even just in relation to things like workforce training, we're now doing a huge amount around VC, we're doing a huge amount around things like CCBT. We know, for example, within mental health that the clinical psychologists have to start developing different skills around technology, because what they'll need to do is they'll have to start interacting with technology and actually becoming or getting to the point where they can draw conclusions from data, which is a very different principle. Oh, I think you're on.
It makes sense that as AI gives us more superpowers, we redesign our overall care ecosystem so that there is a greater access to these at the point of care and the point of need. So let me thank you.
Maybe a different question. But yes.
Again, Chris, for joining our conversation today. Please feel free to stay. I know it's late for you out there in Scotland, so I appreciate you joining, especially in the late hours of your evening. And with that, let me say that our first segment has come to a close. We will take a 5-minute break and 6-minute break and join again at 1:55 Pacific time. Thanks so much, Chris, again, on behalf of all of us. And we don't have audio, so let's say thank you, Chris. Let me just, I should have had an audio to play here right now, but thank you, Chris. And we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, everyone, we'll just take a 5-minute break now, and we will be back in 5 minutes. I'm just going to put up a slide that says exactly that. Feel free to chat and send questions, reflections that you had on the last couple of talks, and we will be back with Ellen Lee and Varsha Badal from the University of California at San Diego at 1:55 Pacific. See you in a bit. Welcome back, everyone. We are joined here now with the first of our research authors, Ellen Lee and Varsha Badal. Welcome to both of you. I'm so glad that we're doing this, where you can join from wherever you are in the comfort of your homes. Well, let me welcome you to the research conversation portion of our section. Ellen and Varsha, if you could unmute yourself and please introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your motivations and your journey to be working at the intersection of good mental health and artificial intelligence.
I'll start. I'm Ellen Lee. It's so nice to meet you all. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist and assistant professor of psychiatry at UC San Diego. So my interest in this work really came from my clinical expertise as a geriatric mental health provider, as well as a researcher who's interested in the intersection between biological and psychosocial aging. And so recently, loneliness and social isolation has become, a really growing epidemic that has real mental, cognitive, and physical health implications. And so that has become a recent focus of my work. And then I was given the opportunity to partner with Varsha, and that's really where this work came from. So I'll hand it over to Varsha.
Hi, thank you to the organizers, Ajay and Dr. Ellen Lee. So I'm Varsha Badal. I'm a postdoc fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSD, working with Dr. Ellen Lee. My background is in computer science, biochemistry, and I have a PhD in computational biology, modeling proteins using text mining, NLP, and machine learning. I think when we are using AI and machine learning in psychiatry, we have come a full circle as AI and machine learning, especially the neural networks, have focused on learning aspects of brain function. We must be aware that learning is not just one aspect of brain function. There are other psychosomatic aspects of brain function which have not been of great interest to computer scientists. However, it is reasonable to expect that very similar connectionist computations play out in the emotional aspect of brain function. The medium of communication may now be more based upon neurotransmitters or hormonal instead of electrical. So my background in biochemistry, proteomics, and AI motivated me in this field.
Excellent. So your paper looks at natural language processing to assess loneliness in older adults. And the background that both of you shared is obviously multidimensional, and there's a lot of interesting problems in this area. What was the path to choosing this particular problem? And if you could shed a little bit of a light on that, and then we'll go into talking about your results.
Sure, I'll start. So basically, we've been studying loneliness for the past few years, and I led a study a few years back looking at sort of the physical and cognitive and mental health impact of loneliness across the lifespan, looking at people between the age of like 24 all the way to 101. And we found that it's a nonlinear relationship with age, between loneliness severity and age. And that also made us think about how increasing social isolation, especially with physical distancing in the COVID-19 pandemic, this has become an increasing problem among older adults. And so one of the studies that we work on in collaboration with IBM, we have a UCSD IBM Center for AI for Healthy Aging, and we've been conducting semi-structured interviews with our older adults. They're all over 65, living in an independent housing within a senior residential community. And we've started looking at how they speak about loneliness, and Varsha's expertise in NLP really sort of made us think critically about how to understand loneliness qualitatively, but on a larger scale, beyond what you can do with traditional qualitative approaches. Sorry, Varsha, do you want to add to this?
Yes, absolutely right. As Dr. Ellen has mentioned, this study was motivated by very practical reasons. And since we had available transcripts of interviews and objective assessments of loneliness, it is of interest to find out how well the expression of loneliness at the time of interview matches up with an objective score, especially when we view loneliness as a perceived lack of social interaction, which is likely affected both by emotion and memory.
I would say that personally, just to add to what you were saying, I would say personally, this is a fascinating topic. We in the organizing community definitely wanted to have a discussion around loneliness. It's a major global problem, getting worse, especially in moments like this where we have some forced physical distancing, and also communication. Communication is so often moderated by custom, by other demographics, by who you might be speaking to, and how various cognitive states come through in what you express as a wonderful topic and broad to look at. So let me invite you to please share your slides to describe to us the core essence of your experiments and results, and I will go off screen so that you can share your slides.
Sure. I'll project. Sorry, Varsha, do you want to take the charge with the slide and we can just go back and forth?
Yes, you go ahead, Ellen. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so just to summarize briefly, we spent some time looking at how people talk about loneliness, and this slide just summarizes some of the big insights that we learned about loneliness and also thinking about where to move in the future. So our interest was actually understanding the emotional content and the sentiment of people's responses to direct questions about loneliness. And so that was the focus of this particular project. Varsha and I are currently collaborating on a future project to look at social connectedness using how people discuss relationships. And using unstructured text from that to actually correlate to how well people feel supported by those relationships. We're also starting to look at how this may correlate with wisdom scores, which is assessed objectively through self-report scales, and also to understand topical drift in how people speak and understand how older adults may sort of shift topics, as well as the density of personal pronouns and how that may sort of affects or referential speech. Varsha, I'll hand it off to you for this one.
So so this is exploration, classification, and limitations. Here,
Varsha, excuse me, please, but your audio is a little low. Thank you.
Let me freeze it. Is it clear?
Oh, better now, yes.
Okay, so here we are exploring the response to question 1, do you ever feel lonely, and if so, how often? So we expect the subject responses to question 1, the question which I mentioned, will mirror the emotions associated with loneliness and the emotional composition of response to loneliness, which is on the left-hand side, that is self-assessment or the qualitative, and on the right-hand side is the UCLA assessment or the quantitative. So we have plotted the median values, emotions, that is the strength of fear, anger, joy, sad, etc., in the range of 0 through 1. And based upon the IBM responses, we see that sadness and fear seems to be 2 predominant emotions embedded in loneliness in both qualitative and quantitative, and which seems very plausible. Additionally, we also see that in the UCLA loneliness, it seems to separate people based on expressed joy as well.
Some of the other significant insights we found in our study was that there were clear gender differences in how in the speech and sentiment content of the speech. So women were actually much more likely to acknowledge feeling lonely when they were quantitatively lonely by UCLA 3 assessment compared to the men, and the emotions expressed if they were lonely were different by gender. So men expressed greater fear in their responses than the women, as can be seen on the left side. And on the right side, this plot shows how the response length was actually longer for lonely individuals compared to non-lonely individuals based on the UCLA 3 score cutoffs that we used. I'll start here, Varsha, briefly. One of the major limitations of this research is, of course, what we use as ground truth. And this is a tricky subject for a lot of our sort of fuzzy psychological constructs like loneliness. The definition of loneliness that's been most commonly used in research is a discrepancy between the perceived quality of social relationships and the desired social relationships. And the gold standard for measuring that is the UCLA 3 score, which is a self-report measure, but while it is validated and very popular in empirical research, it comes with all sort of the limitations that come with self-report measures, including, social desirability response bias, as well as, recall bias. So one of the things that we did was we actually looked at how, when people acknowledge feeling lonely in the interview, how that differed between their UCLA-3 scores as well as self-acknowledgement. And these show the kappas, or the level of agreement between the qualitative and the quantitative assessments. Varsha, do you have anything you'd like to add here?
No, perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay. And then, of course, I think one of the things that we, for this study, we used commercially available AI tools. However, there were some limitations in working with this. I think, as Chris already mentioned, with the challenges of explainable AI and using them in a clinical context, the lack of a really firm ground truth in this case makes it a little bit difficult as we're further trying to understand loneliness as a concept. We also had a fairly small sample size for an AI project of only 80 individuals, and is currently cross-sectional, though we're following people longitudinally. We're depending on a commercially available natural language understanding tool developed by IBM, and this was not specifically targeted for purposes like this. Also, implementing, this type of AI tool makes it difficult to further interpret or justify for clinical purposes. And then, of course, processes like the ones that we've used in this NLP project require a number of different techniques working together. So sort of layering different level of analyses on top of each other, and they may be independent or, be required to work in conjunction. So those were the major findings that we had. We agree that we think the mental health field has numerous opportunities for AI. And we feel like this type of proof of concept study are really illustrative of how speech data can be used to better understand things like loneliness, but we really need to develop better tools. We need to sort of better define loneliness. And I think trying to understand and develop sort of comprehensive, well thought out data sets are a big challenge. Any thoughts, Varsha, to add to this?
Yes, so as you rightly mentioned, we had limitations of ground truth for psychological constructs, and we also had limitations with respect to the AI tool. And yes, it was not a longitudinal section of the study. Yes.
I'll just project our last slide if there are other thoughts. Ajay?
I think this is a delightful subject to talk about and a very rich and impactful subject for the whole globe. So I have lots of thoughts, but let me start with one that came through because early on at the top of the talk, we talked about the power of expression and the value of expression. And, one of the things that's been new over the last 15 years or so, unique in our history, is that we have had the opportunity to express ourselves passively in a public way. So if you think about just scrolling is a passive form of expression, but you're doing it publicly. You do that even more so when you like something in the middle of this passive activity. And so there's these stages of engagement, and at one level is actually typing or saying something, but perhaps at the bottom of that is just mindlessly scrolling the screen, to intentionally scrolling the screen, to liking something, to commenting, and so on and so forth. So now that we have all this digital infrastructure to capture our passive expression or passive public expression, we can imagine that we will find new concepts of loneliness. We might find new correlates to people while they're lonely, expressing themselves passively differently than they do otherwise. So I'm not familiar with the work in this area. So let me just take this opportunity to ask you, for behalf of everybody who's listening, if you're aware of explorations in that realm of specifically using passive expression and measuring passive expression as a measure of loneliness, and what your thoughts might be about how we might go about studying that.
Yeah, this is a great topic. I actually don't know that there's much yet looking at this. I know that there's been a lot of work on passive sensors looking at changes in mental health symptoms, for instance, using smartphone sensors, to using use of keyboards and touch typing to understand whether or not there's cognitive changes or deficits. there's also use of Twitter and Facebook posts to understand whether people are suicidal. But specifically for loneliness, I think that area is hopefully growing. I think the difficulty there becomes, whether or not you have a good ground truth measure, or you have a good way to validate those individuals that you're picking up and assessing. We are currently using ecological momentary assessment where people receive surveys. So it's not quite so passive. They are actually required, because loneliness is such a subjective state. I think that we need a way to assess that on the individual level per their definition of loneliness. Marsha, I'll hand it to you.
Yes, I totally agree. As you've mentioned, we just started and we are still exploring. And EMA would be a good way to go about it. Yeah.
And just to flip that, one of the things that's exciting about working in AI and good mental health is to use AI proactively to boost our capacity and resilience ahead of, or sort of preventatively, but also from a prosperity perspective, so that we are more creative, imaginative, social, connected, rich beings. Now, because of your expertise in loneliness, I'm curious, to those who might be interested in working in AI and loneliness, what are some ways in which, what might you imagine AI could do to address loneliness rather than just detect it, based on what is considered good practice in clinical interventions, or other thoughts you might have on that topic?
Marsha, do you want to start? Sorry, I feel like I've been monopolizing.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I think in terms of loneliness, we think there's a lot of potential to provide meaningful social support through automated services, through chatbots, like Chris already mentioned, with like this computerized CBT. There are ways to have meaningful interactions with people and have them sort of, reformulate their thoughts and their perceptions on their relationships. I think, one of the things we've been seeing consistently in our research is actually that loneliness is inversely related to wisdom. And so we think wisdom, which is sort of this multi-component human trait that includes things like compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection, spirituality, we think a lot of those features are actually probably protective or preventative against loneliness. So our current work is actually looking at developing a compassion intervention to actually improve loneliness. And it's actually more designed about self-compassion. So we think that AI would be a wonderful way to actually provide and disseminate this really widely with high level of validity and sort of fidelity to sort of the original training, especially now that everything is done remotely. At least currently, we've moved all of our research studies to be completely remote. And we think that AI could be an excellent way to connect with people.
I'm with you. It sounds very exciting. And let me relay a question from Martha Russell that came in. Would you comment on the difference between loneliness at a moment in time versus loneliness when comparing or referring to another time?
Okay, so this is one of the major limitations of the UCLA-3 loneliness scale that you guys have hit on exactly. So the UCLA loneliness scale does not have a specific time period for the symptoms and questions that people are asked to reflect on. And so they're really conceiving loneliness as a static trait. Now we know loneliness can change throughout time and situations, so the time scale of that is not clear. So we really believe that, we agree with the question writer that there is likely a momentary loneliness. There's a very big difference, we believe, in persistent chronic loneliness and its effects on health versus those who have situational or even like a circadian rhythm to their loneliness based on social activities throughout the day. And we think those are distinct, and we think the interventions will be distinct. So that's why we're trying to use things like ecological momentary assessment to understand sort of the rhythm, if you will, of loneliness throughout the day and how that would impact outcomes like sleep and stress reactivity and, basically circadian driven biology in that way.
Excellent. There was another question asking similarly about the timescale of loneliness, and there's some other questions around symptoms of loneliness. But just because we're running short of time, and this is a fascinating area, I'm so glad that you gave us a hint of some of the work that is coming in. And for others that are interested, Their slides and paper are available on the website with their contact information. So on their behalf, let me invite everybody to connect with them as you think about their work and other things. Would you like to add anything else, Ellen, as we close your session?
Well, let me ask Marsha, do you have any thoughts before we close?
Thank you to everyone. Yes.
Yeah, thank you all. I think, we're interested in collaborating with other people. We are sort of like, again, sort of trying to cross that bridge between AI and mental health expertise. And so we'd welcome other people who are interested in partnering with us and learning how to co-develop unique tools to study this. Thank you so much, Ajay.
Oh, very welcome. And thank you both. And let me say to all the people who've asked questions that I haven't been able to get to, both in this session and others, I will pass on all these questions to the speakers and take responsibility for nudging them to get answers back to everyone. So thank you again, Ellen and Varsha. And let me now invite our next speaker. Oh, yay, thank you. I forgot to get the sound cloud. Thank you very much. Okay, and our next research talk is by Baihan Lin. And let me just take 30 seconds to shift speakers. So joining me here now is Baihan Lin, who's representing work on unified models of human behavioral agents in bandits, contextual bandits, and reinforcement learning. Welcome, Baihan. It's great to see you. And let me ask you the same question I'd like to ask our speakers in the very beginning. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the intersection of good mental health and AI.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Baihan from Columbia University. Thanks for RJ for introducing me, and it's nice to join the discussion with you all. And the first question is how did I actually get into the field? So I remember when I was in middle school, actually one of my close friends actually committed suicide due to major depression. And we know that the education back in China can be quite stressful, but his unfortunate choice was beyond my comprehension at that time. It was also the first time that I started to realize how vulnerable human minds can be. So since then, I become interested in the field of psychology and actually gradually learned that the mental health is a more and more prevalent problem in our society in general. And I started to organize this kind of mental health support services and groups back in high school and also later in my college. And I hope that at least I can make some sort of differences to people around me in any way that I can think of. However, deep inside my heart, I also wish to probe and solve this problem from a more internal aspect. So actually during the college, I chose to double major in psychology along with my other major in applied and computational mathematics. I have always hoped to actually combine my engineering skills to impact the society in the field of the mental health. So currently, I'm actually pursuing a PhD in Columbia University on computational neuroscience. And my research is mainly to develop new computational models and machine learning algorithms to facilitate our understanding of the neural mechanism of human decision-making and also complicated perceptions, either in their healthy states or in their clinical variants. So although I'm not really a clinical medical student per se, but my ultimate goal is to pursue translational research that can actually provide scalable and interactive tools to assist like clinicians or physicians for critical medical decision. So in my doctoral study, I'm also part of the computational psychiatry team at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center, where we actually have a lot of active and exciting projects that involved, say, multiple psychiatric conditions in different data formats and different stages of medical intervention. And I think that it is actually currently, it's a fantastic time to work on all those topics because it's really a digital era where tons of data can potentially provide critical support for case-based reasoning in clinical practice. And I'm very looking forward to the discussion and potential collaborations in these projects. And I would love to have more conversation with you guys either here or offline. So that's how I get here.
Excellent, Baihan. Thank you for that rich description. So Let me ask you about the problem that you are addressing in this paper. How did you come to that problem? Why do you consider it to be an important problem?
Mhm. Yeah, so for this problem, when I was a medical intern in the psychiatry specialty back in Nanjing Brain Hospital during my sophomore year, the DSM-5, where every psychiatry knows, just came out. So we were asked to actually familiarize with all the long list of updated definition of many mental disorders. And I have to say those psychometrics and also clinical descriptor for each of the disorders took me quite some effort to memorize, and they are quite heterogeneous in so many ways. So in many cases, my supervisor, colleagues, and I have to go through a bunch of different measurement forms and transcript to make even simple diagnosis, which is kind of similar to a computational phenotyping algorithm or flowchart would do. However, I also witnessed that in many scenarios, there's actually an additional barriers that creates a huge gap between the mental health care and also the mental health problems. At least back in China, unlike in many Western countries, actually seeking this type of mental health therapy is not a common thing. And especially in those suburban cities, and can be actually viewed as being weak or dramatic instead of having a real problem. So this factor actually greatly reduced the actual number of people actually physically visit a doctor from the actual huge population of people that actually needs this type of mental health attention. So one recent development that I found quite powerful is actually this digital health, and also the ubiquitous computing, where people can just easily use their cell phone, smartphone, or other device to record their health-related data. And behavioral data like that has also enabled the research field in psychology to investigate many clinical conditions with like simple cognitive tasks like gambling or something like that. So the question that I'm interested in is that can we actually perform computational phenotyping on this kind of behavioral data? In another word, can we enable the users to simply perform like simple cognitive tasks and receive medical advice or other support just given those interaction history? For instance, can we develop like an app where the patient can just play a game and we can tell them what conditions you might have and offer some cogent medical advice accordingly? So to accomplish that, one major obstacle is actually a lack of universal model across different mental disorders. So like my example in the DSM-5. So given our past experience in various topics like on attention and also reinforcement learning of the brain, we finally decided to focusing on the reward processing system as the core neural processing mechanisms, which is supposed to be distinctive among a wide variety of clinical conditions. So eventually we build upon the traditional reinforcement learning model and incorporate like 4 expressive reward processing parameters. And so that's how we arrived at our current project.
Excellent. So this really speaks to the power of digital health. The statistics are that more than half the people who need mental health care do not seek out classic care environments because of just being discovered in the act of seeking out care. And so there is a lot of promise in building these systems, both for assessment, as you're suggesting, but then also for boosting capacity and helping them navigate the next steps. So Baihan, let me ask you to share some of your slides that describe your results. I will go off screen and please share those with the audience.
Can everybody see my screen, or is it sharing the right screen?
We're not in slideshow mode yet. There we are, all good.
Okay, so are we in the slideshow where we only see the slides, right? Okay, yes. Cool. Yeah, so basically the motivation, like I mentioned, is that from the evolutionary psychiatry point of view, all these type of mental disorder, they actually lies on a manifold or a continuous spectrum where all those disorders are actually extreme points that actually arises during evolution for multiple purposes. So ideally, if we can model the entire manifold properly, we can actually do this type of behavioral mapping and for downstream predictive modeling and stuff like that. So on the other hand, from the AI perspective, those extreme versions can also be beneficial in specific environments. So we can build better algorithm based on that. we pay attention to 3 levels of reinforcement learning problem. The first level is the multi-arm bandit, where each action actually corresponds to the reward function of certain options. So for instance, if you have 3 options, which one you want to, which action you want to take. And the contextual bandit is more complicated, where you are also given a context or the current state that you can take as a prior information to make your current decision. So you are trying to learn, you are trying to make an action based on the current information that you accumulated and try to make the optimal action that maximize your reward. And the full reinforcement learning problem actually involves paying attention to multiple contexts across multiple states, because your current action can change your current state. That can yield a different story where you need to pay attention to the previous history or the future outcome as well. So to deal with that, we propose this 2-stream framework where everything that was processed would be separated into the positive domain and the negative domain, where we draw from inspiration from the neurobiological research, where how the brain actually perform the neural circuits dealing with the positive reward and negative reward tends to be different, and they follow different rules. So that's why we have this clean cut of model, and more specifically, during an action selection process, your agent or your human subjects that we want to model would be taking account into the representation from both domains, and you would also be revealed with the reward feedback from the positive and negative domain as well. So given that setup, we have the flexibility to model a wide range of clinical conditions. Shown here is a subset where we draw from a literature review, a thorough literature review of those clinical conditions. And based on their understanding, we set our parameters, 4 parameters, accordingly. So the red parameters are for reward history, how well you would remember the reward history from the past, and also the blue parameters are the reward perception, how you would perceive the current reward feedback that you have. So we tested on multiple cases. Shown here is an example where we're showing on IO gambling task, which is a popular task in psychology and also clinical study. And we also have a lot of human data, around 600 human data here. And we also simulated our mental variance based on the parameters that we set earlier. As shown here, the reward mapping, the reward function for the four possible action is quite non-Gaussian. So it looks quite weird. So basically, you're asked to select from one of the 4 DAGs, and those DAGs has their underlying reward function, which is quite weird, as shown here. And here, shown here, it's the short-term dynamic versus the long-term dynamic of all those all those agents perform over time. So shown here is the percentage of choosing the better DAGs or the correct option. So you can see that they can match many clinical discovery. For instance, the black curve shown here is the addiction. And we see that addiction actually learns to choose the better DAGs or the better action very fast early in the time periods. However, it was caught up by the other agents. So this was reasonable because the addiction patients tends to forget about the negative signals far more than other agents. So in the future, when you actually faces some infrequent feedbacks of punishment or negative reward, you might forget about it, and you are only learning to do myopic prediction for the reward. And some Disney plots, you can also see that they cluster based on this behavior trajectory that we accumulated. We also applied all those different mental variants as well as standard reinforcement learning algorithms on the games. So shown here is the Pac-Man game, where we let the agent to play for 1,000 rounds, and also not only in the classical way, but also in 3 type of non-stationary scenarios. And we see that in most scenarios, our algorithm given a two-stream feedbacks and two-stream framework are much more flexible than the traditional reinforcement learning. And also in certain cases, like here, the ADHD and also dementia, due to their fast switching idiosyncrasy, they actually adapt to the non-stationarity quite well and perform much better than everyone else. So here we can also see it in action, where if you pay attention to the chronic pain patient, it's quite funny because it barely pursues any positive reward, like the pack dot. However, when a ghost comes, it will try to avoid. So it only pays attention to the negative domain. So basically, that actually summarized the result where we want to connect AI with the neuropsychiatry, both in a functional way and also dysfunctional way. We want to do this clinical discovery where we can test theoretical constructs and offer insights about what's going on in those clinical conditions, and also build like humanoid AI systems. And potentially later on, we can even monitor mental health with this type of interactive system where you can simply play simple games or other type of cognitive tasks. So I will leave it to here. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions. We also open source our code and everything. Yes.
Excellent, Baihan. Thank you for that. And it's nice to hear that the source is available openly. And so this is an invitation to anybody who's listening to further experiment along the lines that Baihan mentioned. Baihan, let me ask you something that I remember thinking about while reading your paper is it's great to see using some of the behavioral descriptions of some of the conditions to be inspired to make richer reward functions and use that to make more performant AI methods, especially in the RL settings. I think one of your goals is to go the other way around as well, to learn from what these policies eventually learn as an effective response, given that the reward function is that, and see what that response in the AI space means for the human beings as what they should do to manage their condition, or perhaps manage the condition is not the right way to say it, but to perhaps come up with a better treatment or a more personalized treatment. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about, and perhaps you have some work planned in this area too on that topic.
Yeah, so I think indeed it's a two-way conversation, and our goal was not to merely build like humanoid AI agents, but also how to model the human behaviors. So actually, some of the data shown here already maps some of the human data that we collected with those behavior trajectory that was actually created from artificial agents. And we also have an ongoing project where we were directly fitting our model or framework towards clinical data. So for instance, we want to fit an agent for the Parkinson's versus Alzheimer's or specific ways like that. And we propose this in multiple methods. For instance, we attempted to use inverse reinforcement learning method to actually try to learn the underlying reward function of a certain like human expert, right? And also we also attempted to use deep network to actually match the behavior trajectory so that you can actually make great prediction. So actually we also have some development in the multi-agent application as well. Because we don't want to, we are always interacting with other people or other minds in the society. So it will be good to see how different mental variants interact with each other. So we have a paper on preprint, also under review in the NeurIPS conference, where we let those mental variants and also different class of reinforcement learning agents play with each other on social dilemma game, like iterative prisoner's dilemma. And we also find out that our model can predict the real human data collected across different sources very well. And we also have another project ongoing in that action as well. Yeah.
Great. So I'm reminded of Chris's comments about marketing, or let's put it in other words, persuading people. And you are well aware that explainability has been an active topic of research for at least 5 years in the community. And there have been now new models of explaining RLs in particular, reinforcement learning models in particular. So when we think about that pathway back to maybe discovering what is the right reward function for somebody who exhibits a certain cognitive behavior, no matter what reward function they are living with, what is the reward function figured out through AI simulations that is then communicated back to them? What are your thoughts on communicating to them that this is actually an effective reward function outside of the graph, right? Or beyond the graph, let's say. What are your thoughts on explaining that to humans in the loop, or perhaps your experience doing that?
Yeah. So let me rephrase the problem. So are you saying that because now we are both doing the prediction of how a human would be performing, but we are also having interaction backwards or feedback loop back to the human user, right? So how do you accommodate for the both stream and since now we are mapping like a huge graph of different users, either the artificial agent space or the human space, how do we combine these two together to make a reasonable predictive modeling or something like that, right? So
right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I feel like it is indeed an innate challenge, and we are also considering those critical problems, and we also welcome all kind of collaborations on this topic. So far, my take would be, because in the AI, people tend to use, say, the Turing test, trying to fool a kind of classifier or something like that to actually create like AI that can be treated as a real human or something like that. Perhaps we can also build this type of adversarial systems or interactive system where basically the human and the computer, they are interacting continuously and they are adapting to each other. And it doesn't have to be that way because we are actually creating a new interaction. So we are not actually, and this interaction can open up an entire new space that we haven't covered yet. So regarding the marketing aspect, I also feel like we need to pay more attention on what type of interaction we want to create instead of like just going from one perspective where we want to build better AI or we want to model better the human data, but instead what kind of interaction is good interaction that can facilitate the digital health, right? So so
absolutely. I think it's time for a new kind of test where we will define AIs or whether they're successful at moving our behaviors or moving our health conditions in meaningful ways in the way that other compelling human beings are. So having crossed one level of intelligence capacity, perhaps that's another metric for us to get to. So given our time, Baihan, let me thank you again for your work, and let me ask you a closing question, most of which you've covered before, on what would you like to see solved in this area, and what kind of collaborations might you be looking for?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. As it's actually a growing field, there are actually many interesting things that I would like to pursue. So let me just talk about one thing, which is more recent. So we know that the big data analysis in the healthcare actually usually involves the predictive modeling, computational phenotyping, and also patient similarity. As in my slide, I also introduced about the evolutionary psychiatry perspective. Well, so basically the main idea is that all the mental disorders is in this continuous manifold. I believe this is a good viewing point to take when pursuing all three topics that I mentioned above. So the idea is that suppose we can have a continuous spectrum, we can map our behavioral data onto that and conduct downstream prediction and also medical decision. So in the current project, you see that we handcrafted this type of reward processing parameters to describe this manifold. While it offers useful mechanistic insight, we are also imposing our inductive bias somehow. So however, ideally, I would like to see that those spectrum descriptor or universal biomarkers to be not handcrafted, that maybe unsupervisedly learn across mining across different data formats in different tasks. So I would like to welcome all kind of collaborations, both in the clinical aspect on say, valuable clinical data or psychiatric discovery, and also in computational aspect where we investigate the right way to actually interpret different data modality, like neuroimage, transcript, or other type of like measurement forms or or all different kind of forms. So that's what I think it would be a worthwhile challenge. That's I am proposing to the conversation, and I will be looking forward to any collaborations and discussion. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. There is definitely a view of behavior as a computational substrate, inspired perhaps by models of physics, that we can even use to predict a path to a behavior that we want to ascribe to, or behaviors that have not yet emerged in our species, but will as we add digital intelligences to a computational substrate. So thank you, Baihan, for sharing your work and your perspectives. And let me say to all attendees that please feel free to use the 5 minutes of break that we have now to connect to the authors through chat and even otherwise. Their papers and videos are on the website with their contact information. And Baihan, thanks again for your presentation, and we will talk to you again.
Yeah.
We will take a 5-minute break now, and we will be back at 2:45 Pacific time. I'm just going to put that up on the screen. We'll be joined at 2:45 by Molly Ireland and Kate Niederhofer to speak to us about their research. Welcome back, everyone. We are now joined by Molly Ireland and Kate Niederhofer to talk about their work on profiling depression in social media posts. Kate and Molly, if you could come on video and unmute yourself. Welcome.
Hi, good to see you again. Can you hear me okay?
You can hear you fine, Molly. Kate, you're still on
Okay.
mute. Good to see you.
Hi, AJ. Hi, Molly.
Nice to meet you. Let me just start by asking the same question I'm asking every speaker. Just please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about your journey to the intersection of machine learning and good mental health.
Okay. I think Kate's going first.
Okay, I'll begin. I'm a social psychologist with a background in psychology of language. In fact, a very similar background to Molly's. We were from the same lab in grad school. We've been in digital mental health in the startup arena for about 6 years now. Most recently ran research at a peer support community called 7 Cups, and now run measurement at a new startup called Nest Health, with co-founded by Tom Insel and his daughter, Laura Gregorio. And in my opinion, I guess all roads lead here to this intersection as witnessed by my colleagues on this paper. One former CTO at a startup where I worked many, many years ago. And then Molly, as I mentioned, from the same lab. Really, we came into it as language researchers, fascinated by how people use words and how those words represent who they are. So really the psychological underpinnings of language. I'm constantly approached by people in the computer science world asking me what this model means, why something can be so precise, what's really kind of going on behind the scenes, and I'm provided data to analyze and figure out what it means, what's going on, how to interpret and explain it. And so this topic has just been so interesting to approach from that angle, and also be a practitioner who's trying to understand how do we use a model that's really great to make sure that it's both ethically and practically used in a way that helps people who are engaging in digital mental health.
Okay, and on my side, sorry, I'm using a new mic. Is it, everybody sure it's okay?
Go ahead.
All right. So I'm a social psychologist like Kate. We both were from the same lab, although we didn't overlap in grad school. Like everybody else in this workshop, I think that it was probably a combination. I came to this intersection through a combination of just meeting people and chance and sort of innate interests, but more broadly, you know, friendships with computer scientists, for example, and people in the industry like Kate. More broadly, I think that more social psychologists should be paying attention to questions like this, sort of applied mental health areas, because like some of the other people in this workshop have talked about today, it's becoming increasingly normal to be mentally unwell. You know, so in this pandemic, a lot of the time it can feel like the world is ending, right? Like, why wring your hands about getting ready for a workshop presentation when we're living through an apocalypse? Like in some recent data that I've collected on Mechanical Turk, for example, the usual number of people who qualify as subclinically depressed is 35 to 45%. In this latest sample, it was 100%. So
Wow.
social psychology, which at least when I was in college was described to me as the study of normal people, people who do not have mental health conditions, and how they influence each other. I think mental health is increasingly sort of the jurisdiction of social psychology. So that's why I'm interested in this area.
Excellent, thank you. And it is our hope, one of the reasons for hosting this workshop is that more productive cross-disciplinary friendships form between workshop attendees and listeners, and we make progress on this critical problem. And to your point, Molly, my view is that if we have a mind, we have mental well-being needs. So it's an important and universal problem to work on. Let me invite you to share with all of us the problem that you worked on and describe in this paper, and please.
Do you want to take this, Kate, or do you want me to?
Sure. I think one of the motivations was just to understand what mental health looks like in naturalistic data across contexts. So when Chris gave the opening remarks, he expressed that really nicely, that data often capture people in these expressions of desired change. And I think that's what, this field is based on, those specific moments in time, either in a clinician's office or filling out a self-reported survey, for diagnostic purposes. And we're really interested in the expression and naturalistic data, and then also what the role of language could be as we move forward, given the many different ways that you could look at language, analyze language, and use it in a model, for example. Just trying to understand, how do we, look at both halves of this? So what is the role in language going into it? And then also coming out of it, how can we use not just language, but a model per se, in being implemented in a system that continues to support people in their mental health needs?
I think this is a good segue for me to invite you to share your slides so you can describe your key results and experiments. I'm going to go off screen.
Okay. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Along with the sort of embarrassing self-introduction that I didn't end up using.
Molly, I'm going to mute in case I have background noise.
Okay. All right, well, Kate already covered the rationale, so I'm just going to focus on the method and results in order to avoid too much overlap with what we have already said and what we described in the pre-recorded presentation. Basically, this involved Kate and I, two social psychologists working in different areas, looking at some data collected by Jonathan Schler and Gilad Gecht, computer scientists. And what they did was basically they initially built a classifier based on hundreds of thousands of Reddit posts. These are the original posts, not the comments, from sort of prototypical depressed and neutral forums on Reddit, the social discussion site. So the prototypical depression forum was Our Depression, and the prototypical neutral forum was Ask Reddit. And I should note that that wasn't chosen as a comparison because it's especially positive. It was just chosen because it was sort of typical for Reddit, and it includes some degree of positive and negative posts, sort of a balance. Then based on that classifier, they found additional forums that they categorized as depressed based on having 80% or greater posts classified as depressed, of course, according to the classifier. And they found additional neutral forums, mental health neutral forums, that had 20% or fewer posts in those forums classified as depressed. And based on those additional forums, they narrowed it down to a sample of depressed users who posted in both depression forums and neutral forums, and then compared their posts in neutral forums with users who had never posted in any of the depression forums, who only posted in neutral forums. And these were all people who used Reddit relatively regularly, had posted multiple times over the course of several years. And then for the analysis, they basically threw the book at the data in terms of looking at both theory-driven models using Luke variables. The linguistic inquiry and word count is a common dictionary-based text analysis program used in psychology and other behavioral sciences. And they compared those more top-down methods, models with more data-driven neural network models, such as convolutional neural networks. And basically, the CNN models, CNN-based models beat the more intuitive, more interpretable theory-driven models using Ngrams and Luke. Neither approach was incredibly accurate, but the machine beat humans, so to speak, in this context. And that's not always the case. So for me, at least, that was instructive because it tells us that that there's something missing in psychological theories of depressed language use or psychological sort of language-based models of depression. It could be the case that those models are based or sort of too heavily based on contexts where people are talking in private about mental health relevant topics, diary entries, essays, structured clinical interviews. And I don't know that we can really consider our models of depression be really inclusive and comprehensive unless they also do a good job of helping us predict and understand how people talk when they're not talking about depression. So again, without overlapping too much with the pre-recorded presentation or forcing us to look at too many slides, that was the basic, those were the basic methods and results. Okay, so I should stop sharing, correct?
No, Molly, I think it's good to have this slide up there as we discuss this. Thank you for that overview. I was curious to, as you said yourself, the insight is, in the title of your paper, you talk about prediction insight trade-offs. And in your paper, you talk about this tension between following a theory that may come from smaller data sets in classic ways of studying human behavior in the social sciences, and some of the discoveries that we don't have a theoretical understanding for, but that come from larger data sets or larger at-scale studies that happen all the time as we interact with digital platforms. Now, I was curious if in this particular experiment, there was a kind of a back-propagated learning, theory learning from the results, like why do CNNs perform a little bit better, and what insight might that reveal on expression in neutral forums, or expression when we're not specifically talking about a certain cognitive state, certain cognitive condition rather.
You mean was was CNN's better performance based partly on the fact that these additional depression forms were initially found using a language-based classifier?
Or perhaps in the spirit of your paper, what might, or how might we approach learning an insight about the nature of depression from the fact that a particular machine learning model has performed better on identifying or classifying that state?
I mean, I think in this case, like we described in the paper, to some degree, this is the fact that neither approach performed perfectly or close to perfectly, and the fact that the less interpretable or the uninterpretable model outperformed the more theory-driven model, I think suggests that we need to sort of feed better data into both models, I would say. So there are a lot of kind of situational moderators that you can get directly from the text of people's posts, but also broader things like looking at the types of forums that people are posting in. Is it a small forum that might give people sort of the illusion of privacy, or is it a larger forum? I mean, anytime I see null results or a situation like this where the sort of AI model outperforms the human model, my first thought is to go to sort of, better consideration of moderators. So how can it could be the case that, for example, the linguistic signal of depression is stronger in private forums as opposed to more public or bigger forums. And if so, that kind of consideration could improve both the sort of AI approach as well as the more human or theory-driven approach. Does that make sense, Kate? Or are you just nodding to be supportive?
No, I support your answer. I think that that's a big question. I think this is a call for reoperationalizing the data that we are using to define mental health, and making sure that we have a broad swath of naturalistic samples to understand the lived experience in different settings and at different moments in time.
One of the nice things about the paper that I know that the reviewers appreciated was the framing of the question itself. I think connects to what Kate is saying, naturalistic capture of expression, so that you can detect states when you're not specifically showing up at in the case of Reddit, are depressed, or some of the other forums that you looked at. And this is increasingly important because most of the time we are expressing ourselves on a continuum, and we are in a continuum of spaces. So I think that that's really the way in which the whole field is moving to, and it's been nice to see this work in that area. Molly, you had a slide about ethics, and it'd be nice to hear a little bit more in depth about what your perspective, if you have a perspective about, especially given that you spoke to the inscrutability of some machine learning models that just perform better. Do you have a perspective on how we might work to cross that chasm?
I mean, Kate was the person who came up with the sorting hat analogy, which I thought was appropriate, that the sorting hat doesn't patronize its users, but at the same time makes itself understood. I mean, I think that talking about the margin of error is important in when you're obtaining anybody's consent to sort of automatically model their language use. I think that when people, like some of the previous speakers talked about, I think people tend to be sort of impressed by, but also distrusting of new technology and AI. So if they're told AI believes that you are depressed or AI believes that you are at risk for a suicide attempt, I think that people may be scared of it, but are also probably prone to, on some level, believe it, or at least I am. I think it's really important to communicate the margin of error there, in addition to sort of the nature of, I mean, what I was talking about before, just the idea that models are only as good as the data that's going into it. You know, this model is based on X, Y, and Z in terms of your use of your phone or this website. Kate, I mean, you've actually worked in this field more, so I think you should probably.
Well, I would
talk
extend,
more than me.
I think what Molly says is right. And that's very much the first step is, you know, having very thorough, informed consent and an understanding of what the algorithm is doing, but in the words of the people who are using the system. So Chris also talked a lot about trust. And I think the only way that we as service providers can engender a sense of trust is to transparently communicate what's going on, what it means, but in a way that speaks to people who aren't necessarily engaging in digital mental health services, for example, as such. That's very much an industry term. A lot of times people are engaging in what they think is just a peer support community to connect with others, to be seen, to share experiences. They don't even understand a lot of times that what we would consider a psychometrically valid GAD-7 or PHQ-9 test of anxiety or depression is that instead it's just a survey, a personality test, a couple of questions with interesting labels. So I think it's really important that we understand these user mindsets of people who are engaging in these systems as we consider the practical implications and the ethical ones of telling someone this algorithm predicts that you may be depressed when they're completely not expecting that or understanding the gravity of that labeling.
Absolutely.
I think we also.
Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, this is fairly obvious and something that I'm sure other people have given more thought to, but I think that the self-fulfilling prophecy issue is also a major concern. People vary in the degree to which they're influenced by what other people think of them, of course. So some people would be very resilient to being told that they're likely to be depressed when they're not. But for other people, that categorization or classification could make them feel bad about themselves and could sort of create the mental health crisis or diagnosis that we're trying to avoid.
And so that brings to mind a question I remember thinking about doing your paper during this discussion part of the paper, that, you know, oftentimes when we find ourselves with friends or family or professionals who are skilled at reframing our perception and creating a path to making more positive responses, their reframing is not that one that we would necessarily subscribe to begin with, right? That's why there's a distance between our perception and somebody else's, and there is a path that they sort of support us on getting to. So this is the flip side of being labeled as something that might have negative consequences. So you might consider designing AI that sort of labels you proximally to where you are, but positively proximally to where you are, and might suggest aspects of you, true or not, that it's for some reason things you could grow into. Some of the discussion that we were having with Baihan in the last session spoke to there being computational pathways that we could discover that could take you from one cognitive state to another. And as we speak with you about the importance of engaging people appropriately with the results of AI, where does that land with you, using AI to not label poorly, but label optimistically, but perhaps not accurately, but optimistically and perhaps usefully? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, that sounds a little bit like the attitudes and persuasion research on latitudes of acceptability. You know, you're not going to change let's say a Trump supporter's position from loving Trump to loving Biden, but you could get them to neutral potentially. So you have to be, that sounded to me similar to what you were talking about, the idea that maybe you could give them something slightly aspirational, but it can't be so aspirational that it's kind of out of reach. Otherwise, they're not going to sort of, they won't believe it, or they won't work to gain it. I don't know. I mean, that sounds inherently deceptive though, right? Is that what you're talking about? Like telling people, like telling me like, Molly, you are kind of positive. Like that would make me more positive. I think that could lead people to distrust the chatbot or the mental health technology platform even more.
And I think the discussion here for as the community thinks about designing these things is, if we mimic what we see successful people do, successful, caring, genuine people do, who actually help us out of certain spaces, if one of the strategies is to reframe in a way that we don't consider accurate, but our own lens is actually not effective. And the whole point of the process that we might be on is to update our lens to a more useful place. So there's I think, a question, and Martha Russell sends a question in the chat about how might your research lead the way to a less black and white view of mental health? And I think that's a more expansive way of perhaps talking about the same issue. I wonder if you have any thoughts to share on that.
I like where you were going with that, Molly. I also was reminded of latitude of acceptance. And I think that would be an interesting goal, to think about AI as predictive of one's latitude of acceptance prior to the prediction of a classification that's binary. So understanding the boundaries within which somebody is open to change. There's a lot of work on readiness to change. So that's a great model to use as a moderator in a model, to understand to what degree somebody would be willing to move, and what a goal would be that a user could trust from a service provider. But yeah, I think we tend not to think in black and white. And that is one of the really interesting challenges of a psychologist working with a computer scientist, where we tend to be more insight over prediction oriented, and often looking for nuances and idiosyncrasies, or at least individual differences in the data, more than we are looking for a binary outcome.
I mean, I think that's also where clinical psychology is going, or has been going for a while, right? Kind of moving, like, you need to use the diagnostic categories in the DSM for insurance purposes, let's say, but there's, I think, in interactions with clients, increasing acknowledgement that people's mental health exists on a spectrum, that you're not just depressed or not, especially with, for example, social psychologists like the two of us studying depression. I think it's kind of where we can help is identifying people who are at risk for depression, but who are not yet depressed. I think that it's important to sort of emphasize that in giving feedback to people, that it's a spectrum, and being at the sort of low positive end of it may not mean that you are depressed right now, but may mean that you are vulnerable to depression. I mean, just going back to the idea of communicating clearly to people and informed consent, I don't think that means dumbing things down. Like, it may be simpler to put somebody in a category, but I think that it's really important to acknowledge that just because these people using the site are not computer scientists doesn't mean that they are bad at basic math or can't understand probabilities.
I think the communication between AIs and natural intelligence is a very open problem in the artificial intelligence community. And I think mental health gives us a very compelling framework in which to solve some of those problems. Like, for example, like you were saying, Molly and Kate, using some metrics of readiness to recognize how to even state the same AI intent differently. We think of that sometimes as the cognitive value of an explanation. If an explanation helps you go through a cognitive behavioral valley, then depending on the nature of that valley, what is the right kind of explanation to give you so that you cross it. So it's very nice to see the links between the way you're thinking about it. And I think this is just a call for these two communities to talk more often and more frequently and collaborate. So on that note, let me say to all our participants there, Molly and Kate's and their co-authors talk is on the website, as is the paper, and the contact information is there. And with that, let me thank you both, Molly and Kate, for sharing your thoughts and work with us today. Yay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye.
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 Let me now take the time to bring on our next speaker, Helen Jiang, as a presenter. And please give me half a minute. Kate and Molly, if you could please change your roles back to an attendee. I'm having a little trouble finding you in the attendee list. I see. I see now. Okay, all right, thank you. Thanks, Helen, for your patience, and welcome to the workshop. It's great to have you here, and please tell us about yourself and your background and your path to this intersection of machine learning and good mental health.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, I'm Helen, and I am currently on leave from Georgia Tech, and formerly I was a student there. Yeah, so my research interest was initially in cybersecurity and its intersection with machine learning and machine learning. But I used to work with a lot of people and who have mental health issues. And that will lead me to explore the usability of technology, and more specifically in security in general. And I have this fundamental belief that technology will serve people, and as it should be serving people. So yeah, I teamed up with Irvin, and who has more direct exposure to mental health issues. And our paper is just our attempt to create a process to achieve this goal of usable security in machine learning systems built for mental health, and to have a map towards this end goal of having technology serve people.
One of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation in this workshop is because the conversation about security of machine learning models is an emerging one in the machine learning community over the last 5 years. As AI becomes infrastructure, we start paying more attention to attacks against the infrastructure, ways in which that infrastructure can mislead us because we might think it's all too knowing. There's a lot of work on fairness and bias, adversarial attacks, all of which you are familiar with and describe in your framework in the paper. And to talk about security in mental health applications adds a very real and different layer on top of those considerations for general AI. So we are looking forward to hearing from you more about the framework and the way you think about it. And so let me ask you a little bit more about what motivated you to work on this problem, the specific problem of security in mental health applications, in AI for mental health applications.
Yeah. So I used to work in in-person tech support, and in that kind of job, you run into a lot of interesting characters. So to sum up my observations in all those years in in-person tech support, I've had these three main things on my mind. So the first thing is general distrust in technology, and so, for example, I used to work with this old couple, and both were alcoholic. And way back in 2012, 2013, when Facebook was still this very hip tech company at the forefront, right, pushing for connections around the world. But so as this couple, they started seeking AA, peer group therapy guided by therapists, and they just knee-jerked at the suggestion of having a Facebook group. And I know for a fact, both of them post very prolifically on Facebook before this suggestion. And their knee-jerk reaction was very astounding to me, and makes me realize that, while people use technology in their lives, that doesn't necessarily mean they trust the technology with their mental health, with their state of mind. So that's the very first observation. And the second observation is that the general frustration and disdain at unusable technology, and it's not even machine learning technology, it's general technology. One example that really struck me is that I was helping the 75-year-old retired nuclear physicist, super smart, right? And worked for more than 40 years in the field of nuclear science. but she could not use basic functions on an Android phone, such as returning to the home screen or download an app. And that blew my mind, is that when we're looking at what those technology solutions at improving people's well-being, are we considering if they can use this, if the people we're targeting can use this on their end, and what's the usability? Well, if we can't use it, right? If we can use it and the purpose of those very well-intended mental health services will be in vain, and that nuclear physicist will happen to have depression, and happen to have depression, and it was suggested that there was a video chat going between her and the therapist, but because she couldn't use the app and she had to go physically to the office of the therapist. So that was the second observation. And the third observation, which is interesting when we consider the juxtaposition with the general distrusting technology, is that people tend to have a generally fairly lax in terms of their security awareness. And also their operational models will adhere to just a general population's security mindset. So for example, I see passwords were posted on the fridge all the time, and passwords being shared with the home cleaners, with their caretakers, etc. So yeah, and if we put this side by side with the first general distrust of technology, I think this is a very touchy field to point to, if we want to really deliver mental health care to people who actually need them.
So one of the things I'm hearing from listening to you just now is that in addition to the classic problems with usable security, whether they're around demographics or around use cases, one of the interesting things when we look at mental health use cases is the opportunity tax. That opportunity tax may prevent you from reaching out to new and emerging AI tools that are generally useful. And so it really leads this question of what might be a convincing social proof around a tool, or what might be convincing sort of technical proof around the tool. So let me use this as a segue to invite you to share some of your key slides that describe the core of your paper. And I'm going to go off screen as you share yours.
Yeah, sure. So let's see how do I share. Okay, great. Yeah. So this is the core description of my paper. Yeah, and you can see it contrasts ML system for mental health versus the general human-facing system, and why security in machine learning system might be different. Is different from security in general human-facing interactive systems. So as you can see, in general human-facing systems, security is rather a simple and straightforward issue, in the sense that with security engineers, they have some mechanism in mind. They have some security measures they want to build into the services. And they have a somewhat cohesive and uniform mental models of what the users might behave, right? Of what the users might expect. So, and they build that and they deploy it and they check on that from time to time, and voila, things were good. But if we think about machine learning systems for mental health, and especially the delivery format, things get a bit more complicated. Because on the builder's side, you no longer just have security engineers, you have machine learning practitioners. And security engineers and machine learning practitioners, they may want different things out of the system. So for example, security engineers may want to minimize the kind of data being collected, because in the event of a breach, having lots of data being breached is worse than small amount of non-sensitive data being breached, right? But machine learning practitioners may want to collect a good amount of data, because training, right? Because they want to annotate that, because want to validate with their models. So that while these two goals of security engineers and machine learning practitioners are not necessarily antagonistic, it definitely has some tension. So I would say the first step towards building this kind of delivery product, this product this product, the usability into into any kind of machine learning systems is to resolve the tension between the security and the machine learning practitioners on the builder side, and really think long and hard about, well, what exactly is this machine learning system doing, and what kind of data information are we going to collect, right? So that's the first part. And on the right hand side, what we see, the users no longer have a uniform mode of actions or desires. So for example, it's the same. So for example, a machine learning system, let's say it's a system that analyzes telehealth sessions. So for example, speech or expression, and also all different kinds of modes of actions were in a teletherapy session. So it's not just the patients and the providers using it. So there may be other caretakers wanting to understand what the care being provided, the diagnosis being made, and also the progress being made to provide better care. And the patients may have incentives to delegate the use of such systems to other caretakers. So that also poses a problem on the builders end. So builders end is that, well, in the case that we need to share this kind of information on the user's end, what are we going to do, right? And well, just to take the example from the United States, well, if under the Computer Abuse and Fraud Act, sharing a password, even a voluntarily shared one, counts as unauthorized access. That means, well, if the builders have not considered well on their end about their terms of service, about their informed consent, the patients on the other end may inadvertently putting their caretakers in trouble. So that I would say this is the second aspect. I would say this is the second aspect towards building, to be usable and secure machine learning system that is to take a more inclusive, or even a collection of different user models, and think through the consequences of such user models and their behaviors, and also find real world or clinical validations on that front. And of course, well, all these are just in the design and building phase, right? And as you mentioned, well, the social proof aspect is very important. And I think that is where the trust building with the patient, with the patients, with the providers, with other caregivers, etc. So everyone under the user umbrella to bring them together, to inform them of, number one, what you are getting, number two, what we can provide, and number three, what are the limits of our services. And yeah, so in the sense that it establishes a baseline and expectation, and that would be a very good foundation to build social proof and also encourage mass adaptation. And yeah, and I think this is addressed by the trustworthiness criteria, that is to get these systems to scale.
Thanks, Helen. Since you have the slide up, these pillars are described in more detail in your paper. Would you give people a brief introduction about what these are?
Yeah, absolutely. So these four pillars, I follow the general software development cycle. So, and in terms of context, is preparation. I think I touched on that. Is that for the builders, to really understand what the target user groups, and also their possible modes of behaviors, and the ranges of expectations and technology proficiency, etc. And also to build. That kind of user model into the product or service itself. And the second part is about functionality, is about getting it to work, right? So that has something to do with both the more traditional security aspect and the machine learning aspect. And we want the security aspect to work to allow legitimate users to use it as intended, and defend against illegitimate users who want to abuse it. And on the machine learning end, the mandate is the same. So for example, well, if we have a chatbot services, right, how do we distinguish between what the legitimate users who are really in times of need to talk to a chatbot to relieve their anxiety issues versus for people who just want to screw with the chatbot and will get it to say and do hateful things, right? So a very prototypical example would be the Microsoft Tay incident. So I think we're getting the defense up to for the system to work as intended for legitimate users and defend against bad users is the key criteria for functionality. And then we would get into scale as you were pointing at to build some social proof and adoption clusters, is that to generate trustworthiness within users. So trustworthiness within users by usability, by usability, the first and foremost, and also by some form of informed consent. So that way we can get it to scale. And on the recovery aspect, because well, it's security, right? And just as everything else, it has more pitfalls and has more enemies in the shadows. So we definitely need to consider, well, if something bad happens, some security incident or breach happened, how do we get the system back on track and regain trust with users and rebuild the functionalities that work for legitimate users and to boost our defense against the users and different kinds of attacks.
Let me invite the audience to send in questions if they have any. But in the meantime, let me just reflect on what I heard. Helen, you spoke about you gave the chatbot example, and so that reminds me of access control. Access control in security systems is generally about access control to human beings and traditional entities. But the intention of those systems is never to corrupt the digital system, it's to bypass the digital system. Now, because AI is a learning system, this is an interesting framing of access control that in chatbots, for example. So if you allow and take at face value the interactions of a certain set of people with a chatbot that is learning from its interactions and consider them equal to the interaction with another set of people who may have a very different intention, we have the opportunity to describe new categories of access control. And if we broaden that out, if we think about broadening that out to general security models, and as you know, in computer security, we have attack models and attacker models, and we model the capabilities of an attacker and show different systems models being resilient to attackers with X capability or Y capability and so on. And so this might be an interesting direction for the community to pursue, to think about what do formal or more formal security and attack models look like when you're interacting with a learning system as opposed to just a software system that has been set in stone. It just has a different attack surface. So I think your call out to the learning process being an attack surface, I think is a generative spot from where to think into new kinds of security models, attack models.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what machine learning brings in a lot of very different and interesting threat models than traditional security. And this is a very exciting area of research and also practical product and service building.
And if I can relay the spirit of one of the chat comments, I think there may be an opportunity to have a classifier for somebody who's being a troll and to use that classifier specifically in what data you accept or don't accept and improving your chatbot. And of course, there are such classifiers, but the bringing a security mindset and the kind of tools that we bring in building security models and attack models would, I think, be a useful thing for the machine learning community to do more so and beyond the adversarial settings that it's doing it within. So Helen, let me ask you my final question, which would be, what are your, as you look forward, given what I believe you work as a cybersecurity engineer, have a lot of experience in cybersecurity outside machine learning systems, have thought about how security comes into machine learning settings. What are your aspirations for what problems you'd like to see solved specifically over the next few years? And what kind of collaborations might you be interested in pursuing with this community?
Right. Yeah. So I'm definitely looking for broad broad ranges of opportunities of collaboration, especially to just to pound down what you were saying. So the new modes of security and usability in machine learning systems, other than the traditional adversarial attacks, etc. So that is an area that I'm very interested in going deep and dig into that. And the second digging, and also that's also one thing that I would like to see the community do. And number two is that today I've listened to a number of very good talks, and I think one theme that keeps popping up is, number one, there are lots of data to be collected, and number two, there is a lot of trust and also evidence need to be built for users to actively embrace and use such machine learning systems in mental health. So I would also like to work with the community, and to see the community getting active on the research of generating such evidence and building such trust, and in a more say tangible real world manner, and just in the sense that we're getting into the field and see how the users react. So that's my second aspiration. And to piggyback on that, that's also the area that I'm looking for collaboration in.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, Helen, for sharing your perspective and for sparking this conversation and thoughts amongst us about thinking carefully about security. As a reminder, Helen's talk and paper are available on the website and is our contact information. So everyone's invited to continue the connection with Helen. Thank you, Helen, very much for your talk, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Ajay. I appreciate you having me here.
We'll take a short 4-minute break, and we will come back at 3:35 Pacific time for our final segment, which has a research talk and invited chat, and two invited chats, a larger one and a smaller one. And we will see you in 4 minutes at 3:35 Pacific time. Welcome back, everyone. This is our final research conversation chat in the program today. We are joined by Rida Zainab, who's going to talk with us about detecting and explaining depression from social media posts. Rida, please turn on your video and audio. Welcome, Rida. Let me start by asking you to, let me first start by thanking you for joining us. This is way past the middle of the night for you, and you've been here with us for the whole workshop. So a special thanks to you for joining us at this inconvenient time. Hopefully the content has kept you up, and certainly yours will keep us going. So please introduce yourself and tell us about your journey to the intersection of machine learning and good mental health.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rida. I just graduated with a master's from Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. This paper, which I have co-authored with Dr. Mooley, is a part of my graduate thesis on depression detection using machine learning and explainable AI in English and Urdu language. Here, I would like to introduce my co-author as well. Dr. Mooley is Thomas Hattrick Chair Professor in Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. His research areas are machine learning, cognitive networking, and edge computing. Other than depression detection, his other students are working on explainable AI for Alzheimer's and dementia, and deep emotion detection from text. The motivation for working on depression detection using machine learning in English and Urdu language was that depression is a prevalent yet neglected area in South Asia. I'm from Pakistan, and Professor Mooley is from India. So we wanted to look into the into depression in the context of South Asian expressional languages and culture, and we wanted to see if we can apply the results from research into depression on high resource languages such as English to a low resource language such as Urdu. The number of mental health professionals in South Asia is very low, and access to mental health services is also very limited. So the goal of this work is to provide knowledge which can be used to make mental health tools such as a mobile app which can help depression patients in Urdu language especially. Ajay, you're mute. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thankfully, Zoom tells me that I'm muted with not too long of a delay. So this is a good segue perhaps for me to just ask you directly to go into the core of your material and your slides, so you can explain to us how you picked this problem, your motivation for picking this problem, and your key results.
Can you see my screen?
Almost. We're not there yet. At least for me personally, I see a, yes, we see your slides now. And
okay. Okay, so as Ajay mentioned in the introduction, mental health is a serious public and personal health challenge. Depression alone affects 1 in 15 adults annually. And since not everybody has access to mental health services, this is a motivation for using social media and natural language processing to identify depression from text of depression patients. Research has shown that there are certain linguistic biomarkers like a frequency of personal pronouns and hedonic tone, which can be used to detect depression from text. But this problem is more amplified in the case of low resource languages such as Urdu, because we do not have enough data to begin with. So in this work, we have tried to see if we can detect depression from social media text, and then use explainable AI to see what the model has learned and how the results differ between English and Urdu language. So the data we collected is from Reddit. Since Urdu language did not have a depression data set, as a first approximate, we used Google Translate to translate the English language Reddit post into Urdu language. These are the classification results. they were fairly good across different classifiers. We used two features, bag of words and term frequency times inverse document frequency. We found terms frequency times inverse document frequency, or TF-IDF for short, to be better in terms of depression detection, as it is a better measure of how important a word is in a document. So for explainable AI, we used LIME. For text, LIME gives a list of keywords which explain why the classifier made the classification which it made, which features it was looking at. LIME gave us three important observations. The first was that the non-depression text had a higher number of unique keywords as compared to the depression text. And the second observation was that the number of a person, and this is also confirmed from the from like previous psychological and linguistic texts, that the frequency of use of personal pronouns in depression text was higher than non-depression text. And the third was that such sort of classification is sensitive to preprocessing, especially the removal of stop words. So in natural language processing, often we remove stop words, but this is not good in this case, because we want to focus on personal pronouns. And if we use a stop words list which removes the personal pronouns automatically, then that is not good for this problem. So preprocessing is a problem sensitive method, and it should be taken into account in such problems. Regarding Urdu, an important observation was that we can see in the two tables that although the Urdu text is a translation of the English text, but the frequency of personal pronouns for depression first in Urdu text is higher than English text, which should not be so because it is a translation after all. But we see this difference because the Urdu word for me and in is same. So here I want to highlight this problem, that before designing a natural language processing tools across different languages, we should be mindful of the linguistic and semantic context of different languages before applying results from a high resource language such as English to a low resource language such as Urdu. These are the key results from our paper. Ajay, are you there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead with that. Is that the, okay. So,
yeah.
So this brings to close the main results. Are there reflections that you have in terms of, I'm just to take a step back. So since I read the paper, one of the things that you explore in the paper that is not often explored in this work is what can we learn from an explainable method put on top on the result of an AI in terms of how that matches with what is known from the cognitive sciences. And here there's some convergence with the frequency of first person pronouns. Was there some other observations that you made, or or the LIME coefficients hinted at as being potential hypotheses that could be tested out in a classic social science experimental setting?
So the primary thing which LIME helped us was in confirming the observations from psychology literature and seeing it being applied in machine learning and artificial intelligence as well. We saw from the results of LIME that the AI model is also focusing on personal pronouns in direct depression. So LIME basically helped us in confirming the observations of literature, and that is, I think, the main contribution of LIME. And also for like Urdu language, it highlighted a problem when we transfer the results from a high resource language to a low resource language without keeping in context the different in semantics and linguistics of the low resource language. A limitation in this work is that the Urdu text is not from an organic Urdu language resource. It is translated from English language because there are no Urdu language text data, enough Urdu language text data available. So we were not able to gather much cultural context using LIME, which is a limitation in this work, and which we would like to seek like more collaboration and more work on. But the main contribution of LIME was in relating the findings from literature and the findings from machine learning and AI regarding depression, and the features which are used to which can be used to classify depression.
I think another interesting aspect that your work specifically spoke to was looking at low resource languages. And one of the things about expression is that it happens on a long tail. So 20 years ago, the use of emojis in text was not very common, but now we have sophisticated GIFs that serve as memes and serve multiple communication purposes, sophisticated communication purposes. We also have other modalities of communication that are sometimes woven into natural language. New words emerge all the time. New abbreviations emerge on social platforms all the time. And so in some ways, we always have a low resource tail, even in a high resource language like English. And I'm curious to hear your observations, thoughts, or hopes, even perhaps in building machine learning systems that deal with emerging low resource margins of any language, because that is often, those tend to emerge often in places where the volume of communication is high, such as social media platforms, and they tend to spread socially. They tend to spread socially. So I'm curious how you think about that problem in general beyond your work as well.
So in high resource as well as low resource languages, the expression of depression and the expression of emotions, it varies across many different layers of the society and of age groups and of gender. So for instance, in South Asia, a lot of social media activity is not in the classical Hindi or Urdu script. It is in Hinglish, which is a mixture of Hindi and English. And the same happens in Urdu. We have a mixture of Urdu and English. And in my personal experience, I see the younger generation often using more English words in their Urdu conversation, and the older generation not doing that. And a lot of social media text from the Urdu language speaking community is in Roman script. So that is the English script, but the language which they are writing in is Urdu. And the same happens in Hindi, and I'm sure other South Asian languages and low resource languages. So this amplifies sort of this problem and adds more dimension to this problem of depression detection and text classification generally as well, because we do not have an Urdu language depression data in the Urdu language script, and then we do not have Urdu language data in the Roman Urdu script, which is more common on social media. We do not have NLP libraries like Word2Vec for Roman Urdu, which is often more commonly used on social media than the classical Urdu script, which is present in the newspapers and in books. So language is natural language processing problem, I think, is more diverse in South Asia and low resource language communities than high resource language.
Yeah, it is definitely a broader problem, and I don't have an answer to it, but just hearing you speak made me wonder if, as you know, recent progress in the last 1 or 2 years in natural language generation has used various attention-based mechanisms, and those attention-based mechanisms might be an interesting way to think about, for example, what meme you might replace a sentence with or insert into a sentence, or what emoji you might put into a sentence by taking out a word and learning the emoji that sort of replaces it the right way. And perhaps transfer learning has a place to play in it as well when we combine that with attention-based mechanisms. So
another observation, I'm sorry,
please.
I'm cutting you off. Yeah. Another observation in this work was that I often see on social media the use of translation bots and translation algorithms to translate a text from one language to another. So on like Facebook and Instagram, if you write something in Roman Urdu, that gets translated into English, and that is very good. But you have other low resource languages in South Asia as well, for example, Punjabi. So if you write something in Roman Punjabi, which is English alphabet used to write Punjabi, then the translating algorithm, it identifies it as Roman Hindi and translate it using Hindi lingo, but that is actually Punjabi. So social media, natural language processing in low resource languages is challenging in more than one way.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's right. It's not a reversible transformation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Another aspect that came to mind and then escaped me, which will come back to me again. Oh yes, the focus on culture and the expression of the same sort of communication or intent that expresses itself differently, just culturally, not just with language as the vector. In our very first research talk, we heard about that from Varsha, and I'm curious specifically because you have looked at two unique things in this paper in our program, one, 2 languages, and the other using an explainability method. I guess I have 2 questions. One is, having seen some of the limitations of LIME in this context, what might you hope from in explainability method? So LIME is model agnostic, but perhaps we can build more model specific methods. What ideally, as you seek to understand certain cognitive states from communication, would you want from the core machine learning explainability model? And that's one question. The other question would be just to hear your thoughts in general about building more resilient machine learning models that are resilient to cultural expression, and even within a culture, demographic expression or other kinds of variations that we see.
So I'll answer your second question first. To build more resilient models which can perform across different languages and different modes of expression, I think the primary challenge is collecting more data and like more diverse data. And other speakers in this workshop have also hinted at that. So that is the key challenge. In my work specifically, I think building tools which can help us collect such data would be useful, and also applying the same sort of analysis which we have done for depression feature identification in psychology literature, replicating sort of the same methods in low resource language, such as looking at the text and poetry and novels of depressed authors. That would be useful in getting like more culturally nuanced features which can be used for depression. And the second question, I think this more data and more like domain specific data, if I may say, that can help us get more insights from explainable AI models, because if the data is not right, then explainable AI cannot do much on that.
Right. So Rita, let me close by asking you a more open-ended question around your aspirations for AI in this field. What problems would you like to see solved in the community? You touched a little bit on that, but let me just ask you that to see if you have any others that you'd like to offer to the community, and other kinds of collaborations that you might be looking for as you yourself work to address some of these issues.
Other than depression detection, I think text classification in general in low resource language is an overlooked area, and also I'm sure in other languages as well, but in Urdu, a lot of social media activity is pictures of verses and pictures of poetry. So combining the natural language analysis by not just focusing on text, but on other modes of expression using language, but in different ways, perhaps, for example, memes, that would be useful as well. So I think I would want to see more work. I would be interested in more work in multidimensional address of this problem of mental health classification and depression detection.
Excellent. And let me amplify a comment that Martha made on the chat, that the cultural and linguistic dimensions are fascinating, as you were expressing, and that there is research on the cultural foundations of learning, and they sound like they would definitely have important insights to all of us in the machine learning community. So with that, let me thank you, Rida, for sharing your work with us. And it is almost 4 a.m. your time. So once again, and a special thank you for your resilience in sharing this work with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And with that, let me shift our talk from the research conversation segments to the second invited conversation of the day. I'm delighted to introduce Lily Rahimi. Lily is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California, and she has been active in digital health for several years. And for those of us working in machine learning, she presents another complement to the kind of talk that we heard in the morning from a government side, more from a practitioner side, as to her experiences and aspirations for this intersection. So let me invite Lily onto the screen shortly. Welcome, Lily. We can see you.
Great.
And we can hear you. Excellent. Well, we're so glad that you are joining us. We've had a day where we talked about, we started out by overviewing the area. I know that you joined us for some segments, so just to catch up, we spoke about a national level initiative in Scotland. We had researchers speak to various aspects of machine learning and the progress and open problems in that area. And now we're looking forward to hearing from you about some of the spaces that you see for innovation in this area, some of the needs that you see as a practitioner in this space. So let me start by just asking you to introduce yourself and telling us a little bit more about your journey in digital health, and please.
So I'm a California licensed marriage and family therapist. In the last 3 to 4 years, I've been exploring digital health and the applications in therapy. I specialize in disease management for chronic conditions and mindfulness, but I'm also terribly interested in how we can add value to the therapeutic experience by exploring all different kinds of sciences. So artificial intelligence, machine learning has been a great interest of mine, and I'm honored to be part of the conversation today.
Great. So one of the things that I think the more technical amongst us, and perhaps all of us, would find interesting as a way to seed our sense of what the counseling process looks like, as you reflect on that human-to-human connection that is formed there, and as the human work that trained counselors do, what are your thoughts for what makes for an effective partnership there, and what might make it difficult as we seek to learn from that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that goes into therapy, but I'd say the most essential is the relationship. So what we know from the research is if you're aligned with your therapist, if you're at ease, talking to them, you feel comfortable, you feel like you're getting something out of the sessions, therapy has a much better outcome. Now that kind of makes common sense, but a lot of people go in expecting or thinking that they're going to align with every person that they meet. And if they don't align, they kind of give up. So you'll see the average rate of therapy is like 1 session on national averages. That doesn't mean that therapy isn't for everybody, but it's about finding somebody who's a good fit. So what I tend to say is I might be a great therapist for some, not a great therapist for others, and that's okay. But where I see the future in therapy is looking at finding ways to match people, not just based on scheduling and specialty per se, but looking at more nuanced ways of matching people to those that might fit their needs, but also their personality, their style of communication, and also recognizing that changes over time. So what might have worked for me when I was 20 might not be the same as what worked for me when I was 30. And really reflecting upon how that can help support the future of mental health.
So this is a classic, search is a classic problem in computing, and now we see a version of it in finding matches between guides and people. that's very relevant to the conversation that we're having today. I think we were talking earlier in the day about how there is a multiplicity of pharmacological interventions, of counseling interventions, and just for one person facing a particular problem, like you said, at one age versus another age, there's a real need for personalization. And we were reflecting on how the general clinical process is also full of experimentation and adaptation as you interact with somebody. And that fits the natural search style paradigm in AI. So I was curious to hear your thoughts about your own. So designing AI to some degree is about designing something that learns from responses. And so there are different branches of therapy and different skills of people in how they adapt to a person. So curious to hear your thoughts about perhaps not the algorithm of therapy, but some of the aspects and procedural flows that people who are listening, who are building machine learning algorithms, should be aware of when they think about building AIs that augment the work that you do.
Yeah. So I would say, therapy is really an iterative process, much like a lot of computing and technology is. You try things on for size, you see if they fit, and then you go from there. But what you also learn as a therapist, that kind of art that happens in the interaction, is learning what particular strategy and in which way is it delivered works for this person. And then similarly, what are the types of exercises or practices that are very similar to that might a person also benefit from? And over time, I've learned sort of, okay, if somebody presents with a certain set of conditions or a certain set of communication style, there's approaches that I've tended to find work better in some populations, but I never assume, right? You always want to connect with the person and make sure it's really working for them. So some of the ways I envision, where we could learn from those is by putting out exercises, obviously learning and seeing what people respond to, but also gauging what other types of things based on their personal interests or things that they might not even know that they're interested in, might we also suggest at various points in their treatment or in various points of how they're feeling, to see if those would actually be beneficial and helpful. And then also, how would we rate that being beneficial and helpful? It's not necessarily just self-rating tools, but there's lots of different applications and sensory things that we have now that we never had in the past that can very quickly identify, did this really work for this person or did it not? And then also, more importantly, maybe it didn't work at that certain point in the day, it might work at another point in the day, and being able to test and retest those sorts of things. I also love to use tools to see, if people can self-regulate. So what I teach in therapy is all kinds of tools for regulating your emotions. The other thing I also teach is, though, using these applications and various tools to self-regulate, to check in and use that moment as a mindfulness moment to kind of see, do I really feel the worst that I've ever felt? Do I know right now a strategy that might help me? Will there be a suggestion for a strategy that might help me if I'm really stuck or I can't think clearly, which is very common when you're feeling anxious or depressed or stressed out. So there's lots of different ways where we can kind of create nuanced interventions that are very specific and tailored to somebody based on a pool of data that we gather from a larger group.
I think this model of partnership between humans and AIs is one that the community has been excited about this past decade. And we're now getting to a place where we do have dense enough sensors, rich enough sensors, and interaction models for domain experts to guide the machine that is hoping to help them. You brought out at least two specific things: measurements that can happen more automatically and digitally, and also interventions. Some choices of interventions can be offered to the domain expert. And if we broaden that out a little bit and we think about other ways in which, if you could have an AI assistant do anything for you to support you in the work that you do, especially at a time of heightened need, already knowing that the need is more than the supply to meet it, what might you want the community to build AIs to do?
There's a number of things. So there's all kinds of support and ways we're trying to get care to people, which is, of course, the first priority, right? Supporting folks and getting them connected to care is huge. but supporting those that support them is also huge. We're seeing that out in the climate, right? Providers are burnt out, they're exhausted. We're not just in a physical health crisis right now, we're in a mental health crisis in this country. So there's lots of things that I would love as a provider. I would say among them at the highest level for me, beyond connecting folks that might be a great fit for the style of therapy that I provide, I would love to see patterns of sort of how somebody is doing, when were they feeling their best, and what might suggest that they were feeling their best. So looking at various combinations of things, but actually that being fed to me as opposed to me having to search and sort it all out based on a number of graphs or a number of data that's out there. The other thing that might be really helpful is just based on their interests, suggesting other interests that might work well for somebody who's similar to them. And it's not to take away the absolute uniqueness of any individual and paint everyone with a broad brush and say, well, in this situation, this is going to work for everybody. That's not true at all. But to say, hey, I might not have the full library at my disposal. What are the other things or combination of things that might work for this person? And for that to be actually flagged to a provider as a suggestion point, I could take it or leave it. That's super, super helpful. So just a summary of what's going on and looking at, let's say, sleep patterns versus eating patterns versus all these things that we know impact mood. And then also, suggesting some things that might be really, really helpful to use for somebody who might not be feeling well. There's lots of stuff that can happen to the provider and then also to the client asynchronously. That doesn't have to be with me in a session. That can be quite helpful.
Great. I hear you say that building research assistants that generate hypotheses would be quite useful because it would sort of reduce some of the work that we do to search and start from a more sifted place and then bring in your intelligence. Let me relay a message that came in on the chat from Martha Russell.
Sure.
What cues do you use to determine if you want to refer a patient to another therapist? How do you know it's not working? So the connection, there's a crossover in the natural realm and the digital realm. What we learn or understand about when you make that handoff may help us understand when we need to do that between a machine to a human.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So what I'd say is there's a few things. So at the start, I always do a full screening and a full intake to kind of ascertain whether or not I'm the right fit based on my areas of expertise or the style of therapy that I provide. So I might just use that information to refer out. But let's say over the course of treatment, I'm discovering that something is not aligning or fitting. Of course, I'm going to be talking with my client on that issue and speaking about what I'm noticing. That's the thing that any good therapist worth their salt's going to do. But what are the cues that kind of signify that for me are a few things. Absolute distraction during the session, absolutely not engaging in any of the work that I'm suggesting. So maybe I'm not suggesting the right practices. Absolute lack of conversation at a standstill, and maybe they're not ready, and that's fine too for therapy. I would say that those are some big flags that indicate that it might not be a good fit. The other thing that we always look at for as well is resistance or absolute pushing back on the therapist with every suggestion. Now we're used to people pushing back. It's actually healthy. Push back, it's good. I don't want you to follow every suggestion I give you. That wouldn't be healthy either. But it's important to also look at if they're consistently resisting everything. What does that mean about the therapeutic relationship? Is this worth their time? It may not be. So those are some cues that I would use to kind of help indicate it. Some nonverbal cues really depend on their eye contact. And I mean, if you were evaluating that degree of what's going on. And then I know that there's a lot of research out there that's looking at even the way that someone speaks, their tone of voice, the semantics. I think that some of that can also give you cues about interest level, and you might even be able to detect with certain nuances and changes in voice. I'd say the number one thing that makes people not want to be with a therapist is not feeling like they're validated or understood. And that can sometimes be total mistake and not meant by the therapist, and it's just an interpretation. But other times it can be, we're completely from different worlds and this person doesn't feel like they're heard. And so that can also maybe cue me to get them into somebody who might be, might fit a criteria that I don't fit, maybe a gender that I'm not at, or an age that I'm not at, something along those lines. So those are some of the things that I tend to look for.
So spurred by Martha's question, I would, here's another one. So the flip side of that, what are some techniques? So I stop because I'm thinking too many things and I should just sequence them out instead of giving you 5 questions at once. So there is the question of building, you've probably experienced a lot of digital entities, digital bots that we're hiding away from because perhaps we were not understood by them. Perhaps they were not well designed enough. Perhaps their responses to a particular moment were not appropriate. And then we quickly paint them with a brush and it takes a long time to come back to them. And they're very simplistic techniques by which we come back, by which they invite us back, notifications or some silly engagements and so on and so forth. So spurred by the question that Martha asked, let me ask you as a human being, as a trained, skilled human being who's caring, who is invested in the folks that you are guiding, what are some effective ways that you find of reestablishing that connection? Because I can imagine that it is whatever we hear from you and learn from you is not just important in that moment, but it's also important in maintaining a relationship and in teaching people how to do that for themselves. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. So there's a whole school of thought with therapy, a whole model called motivational interviewing, which is very helpful for eliciting and looking at the either ambivalence that's going on with somebody, or the fact that they've kind of felt like there was a misfire going on. Now, most therapists who practice under that model will ask, does this fit for you? Does this work for you? Which is very different than a push notification that might be sent to somebody at the wrong time and place, or absolutely inappropriate for the person given their other conditions that they have or other things that are going on in their life. And so part of what I would do is actually ask and check in, you know, what was helpful? What wasn't helpful? Something I'm sensing that something is off, especially if their tone of voice changes or they start acting differently than they normally did in therapy and they've completely disengaged. May or may not know the answer to that. They may not feel it. And I could be misinterpreting something, but then that opens that door for conversation. And I don't see enough of the asking, would this work for you? Or is this helpful for you? Or really checking in on rating how helpful something was for somebody in a way that isn't so cumbersome for the person. You know, obviously we want to take the burden off of the person for having to, you know, check in on how many things are actually helpful. And maybe there's other ways to rate how something was helpful. Did their blood pressure go down? You know, do they breathing easier? There's all kinds of unique ways we might be able to see if somebody can re-engage and feel alive again in the therapy. But I would ask, you know, I would really plainly just put it out there. Did this work? Did it not work? What could I do to make it better? Some people love answering that question. You know, they love to give the feedback. Other people feel burdened by it. Sometimes as a therapist, I tend to know, you know, based on my experience and the years and years of doing this, who are the people that I might ask more of because they're going to want to give a lot of feedback, and who are the people that don't respond well to that loop, and do I do a little bit of that less with? And so I think some opportunities in AI are evaluating that human beings are not going to come in with one set of criterion. What really works well for one person and the way that they're going to respond is very different than another person. We already know that based on all the things that we've tried, but I think it's important to really investigate, you know, asking and seeing how people feel, to be able to collect enough data to understand, oh, when these sorts of things happen, or the way that we ask this, the way that we push this forward to them, either helped or it didn't help. You know, I believe there's some research on notifications being annoying for some. So it's important to maybe do it in a way that delights them and feels like it's about them, not about getting data. That's the other component. You got to make it useful and make sure that whatever shows up next for them is actually maybe more aligned with what they're looking for.
So a couple of things that I heard in what you said was there might be more easily a perception of care when a human being is interacting with another human being because of the second thing, which is that we use language evocatively, persuasively, kindly, compellingly, and as a machine learning community, there have been massive advances in natural language generation over the last 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, and the rate is increasing, but there is still a genuine gap. The kind of interactive conversation that we're having right now, the kind of interactive conversations that you outlined to us are the source of building trust, reeling people back in, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a genuine opportunity for a certain number of years from now for machine learning as it learns to explore a very high dimensional space that language explores with anybody else, whether you are serving them as a guide or if you're just exploring something with them. And the other one that shines through in your comments is not the facade of care, but the genuine perception of care, because certainly the machine is not being programmed to present anything beyond what it's been programmed to present. And so certainly programming it or building it to learn how to care might be a way to frame this problem for our community, learn how to care, because we've learned how to recognize numbers or learn how to speak, but learning to care is perhaps a different skill that we need to approach in the same systematic way by having data and building learning structures. And if that sparked some other things in you, we'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say nuance and tone is everything, and that is what a human can bring to the circumstance, right? But let's say you wanted someone to, or AI or machine to tell you that they care. Perhaps there's a set of circumstances it identifies that flags your provider, right? And make sure that, hey, we're going to get you the care that you need. Here's some resources or immediate places to talk to get you care if they're interested, right? There's a lot of research being shown on people who text more than respond to talking to somebody. But if that presents itself as an option, or there's a few options that they can choose from in a way that doesn't feel like they have to, but feels that it's more that they want to, and obviously delights them in a way, or feels like it's connected to them. I think that can really show that a machine or an app or whatever cares, that it's flagging for a reason. It isn't just, something that's like, okay, I put in that I'm in a bad mood and the exact same response shows up every single time. Because, as we know in other types of research, if you're like a nurse working in a hospital, you hear the same tone every time. You're going to start ignoring that tone because it's going to fall into the background and not be interesting. So are there ways that we can intermittently reinforce, engagement, or make sure that people feel that they're really connecting to something new and that's tailored to them? I think is really, really valuable. I would say that there's lots of ways to show that you care, that involve using the AI to connect humans, because we also know from the research there's two predictors of people feeling a lot happier. One is flexible thinking, so the ability to think imaginatively and break those cycles of really worried cyclical thinking. The other is support systems. So actually being connected to others is huge. So of course, I'm biased. I'm not going to say don't connect to a therapist and engage with a human. I still feel like that's very important for people to do. But let's use, these technical tools to kind of support that relationship and take it further. I can much more quickly identify patterns when I have them presented to me, especially if they're monitoring somebody when I'm not with them. Because if I ask them, how was your week? They might highlight the highest highs and the lowest lows, but a lot of the information in between might have gotten missed, or they might have even forgotten something huge. Oftentimes they'll tell a therapist on their way out the door what's something huge that happened, and you're stuck like, okay, we could have spent an hour talking about just that. And so by knowing and identifying patterns in their day, or seeing like how it was, I can also prompt those questions that already exist. That ability to do that already exists, but it helps because I can say, wow, you were really on a low mood on Wednesday. What was going on? And it jogs their memory. So, it's important to kind of look at the fact that I don't see it as an either or. I see it as very much an and something that can super, super supplement the work that I do.
Excellent, Lily. I knew that we were going to go through our time in a blink,
Right.
and so we have. It's been delightful for all of us to hear from you, who's practicing in the field. I think a couple of takeaways for us in machine learning vocabulary is to use the human superpowers of caring and language and start thinking about building machines that can learn to care and can learn to explain. And as you said, the community also is deeply invested in the model of AI where we augment the capacities of human beings. The insights that we get from learning to care and learning to explain might assist you in giving you hypotheses or strategies and so on and so forth. So I think this is an exciting space to be in. We thank you for taking the time to share some of your thoughts. Clearly step one of a conversation, and we'll look forward to talking with you again sometime.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lily. We are now going to switch to the last invited conversation of the day. This conversation is with the global head of human resources at Fujitsu Limited. Fujitsu is a very large global company across all continents with about 140,000 people. And as you can imagine, this executive roles includes caring for the well-being of this entire workplace. And Fujitsu itself is going through a transformation from a purely technology company to a transformation-centric company, a company that helps our customers transform to a faster changing world. And for example, very recently, we announced a shift away from a central office to distributed offices across the world, where we rethink where we work and when we work and the place of work itself, the unbundling of time and space, the time and place of work that we are experiencing, all of us during this pandemic. Fujitsu has taken this moment to transform its entire workplace practice for the future with the current moment as the impetus. So that's just one example of the many things that workplace wellness leaders have to think about when they think about engineering workplace wellness at scale. And in the lead up to this particular conference, I had the chance to talk to a couple of workplace engineering leaders, and I can tell you that they're deeply excited about the promise of AI in helping them manage this well-being engineering at scale. They're used to people and staff and managers being responsible for workplace well-being. But as we heard from a variety of practitioners today, human beings love to be augmented in their superpowers with all kinds of technologies, and AI has a role to play there as well. So I asked Hiroki Hiramatsu, who is the Executive Vice President and Head of Global HR for Fujitsu, what his thoughts are about AI in workplace well-being at scale for the future. What are his concerns? What are his aspirations? And because of our wide time difference and so on, he was kind enough to record his answer as a video message, which I received this morning, and I'm looking forward to playing it for you now. So please bear with me for half a minute as I learn how to share that in here. Almost there. Okay, this is Hiroki Hiramatsu.
Hello everyone, my name is Hiroki Hiramatsu, the head of Global Human Resources at Fujitsu. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this important conference and workshop. Unfortunately, I cannot join you this time, but I'd like to express my heartfelt appreciation for giving me the opportunity to present through this video message. I hope today's workshop will be meaningful to all of you who are attending today. With regard to this topic, I would like to share my thoughts on the questions that I received in advance from Ajay, the lead role of this conference. In recent years, the world has been experiencing an uncertain era of rapid change, and various threats to global sustainability are emerging. Fujitsu's purpose is to make the world more sustainable by building trust in society through innovation. This purpose guides us as we provide value to our customers through AI and other digital technologies and proactively contribute to the resolution of social issues. In order to realize this purpose, as the person responsible for personnel affairs, I would like to make the company rich with trust and autonomy. We want to create an environment in which diverse and talented employees who sympathize with the company's purpose can quickly connect and innovate throughout society. In the new normal age, trust and autonomy will become increasingly important. Technology such as AI is evolving steadily, but I feel that research on its impact on humans, especially on the psychological side, has not caught up. I feel rather uncomfortable with all the attention being focused on the news that human work will disappear as AI develops. We can be brave and self-directed if AI is credible enough to improve our productivity, suggest new possibilities, and give us hints to improve our relationships. I don't think we can achieve well-being without such autonomous action. Fujitsu has also been active in providing mental health care to our employees in Japan for many years. Company physicians, healthcare staff, and our HR department have worked together to support employees and their managers. In addition to mental health counselors, we have also appointed workplace development staff in each workplace to provide daily care to managers and employees, and to provide dedicated support for preventive measures, early detection, follow-up for return to work, and so forth. Looking ahead, while Fujitsu ourselves is transforming from an IT company to a DX company, we would like to further strengthen self-care and manager support, as well as practice mental health care for employees by utilizing AI technology and share our experience with society as reference. Fujitsu has a strong commitment to AI ethics as reflected in its Fujitsu Group AI commitment, and understands that misuse or misinterpretation of AI can cause various adverse effects. As a company engaged in the research and development and business of AI, Fujitsu will use its values to guide the path it pursues with AI internally and externally. At Fujitsu, we are committed to human-centric mental health care that combines AI technology with the minds and the knowledge and experience of people. Our aim is to maintain and enhance the health of employees and the company while achieving sustainable growth. Thank you very much.
And as I reflect on that message, I hear some themes that other leaders in other workplaces have shared as well. There is a need to augment their existing care staff inside with AI, but most importantly, the first touch points for most of us are our managers. Well, we might say the first touch points for all of us are ourselves, but in a workplace setting, it's often externalized to a manager. And so as a community, if we think about creating workplace well-being tools at scale, I think the path to that genuinely does go through augmenting the capacities of us both as individuals and of us as managers. And reflecting back on that larger view of mental health being not just about mental well-being, but other aspects such as food, shelter, personal finance, education and management. Education and management are two components that show up quite often in the workplace. And even doing better project management, better time management has direct implications for workplace well-being and therefore for our own individual well-being. So with that, that's the theme that's reflected in the view from the workplace. And that brings us to the end of our invited chats as well. And so this is the moment where I just say a few words about the afternoon that we experienced together. Let me just once again thank my co-organizers, Martha Russell from Stanford and Ansi Smidlund from Aalto University and Ilmarinen for their optimism and partnership in bringing together a community of all of you that is working in multiple ways to address this problem. My view is that mental well-being at scale and well-being at scale is a decidedly solvable problem. It requires the participation of a lot of different constituencies, and we had those present in our conversation today. In order to continue this community, we are going to make resources available of the talks that we had today at the workshop website. The simple URL to remember is goodmentalhealth.ai, goodmentalhealth.ai. And there are other things that we plan to host on that website. One that came out in conversation with some of the authors was a list of open problems so that people can find collaborations. Another was a list of data sets. Data sets in mental health for machine learning are far fewer than we would like. We are just starting in some clinical practices to collect high fidelity transcripts between, for example, counselors and patients or other kinds of clinical care settings. But there are other consumer settings from which we can collect this data, and that can be used by the community. So that's another thing that we do. And I think the last call would be that in this moment that is a powerful one for innovation and education, all of us as scientists and leaders take the charge to serve our communities, to be leaders in our communities. There are many platforms today in which people can share their views, and we have this beautiful cocoon of a conference where we have similarly minded people moving a conversation forward together, but we're moving this conversation, but we are moving this conversation forward together in service of humanity. And reaching humanity is another leg beyond the conference, and that starts in our communities. So at goodmentalhealth.ai, we host meetups in communities across the world to help people build better experiments for their own mental health and build better tools for their own mental health. And that may be another space in which we all as researchers can connect and contribute to the world. In addition, you may have your own experiments that you want to run and more ways in which you want to serve your community and are serving your community. And so at that website, we will continue to create hooks for you to find and connect with each other and make progress on this really important and very solvable problem. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time and for your work in this area. And the next time we are bringing this workshop to a machine learning conference will be in January of 2021 at the International Conference of Pattern Recognition. This is the top conference in pattern recognition. It's going to be held in Milan, but very likely virtually. So look out for a call for papers and other ways to participate at that event. With that, let me thank you very much. I'm going to go off screen, but I will leave the webinar open for some time so that if you'd like to chat with people you see in the chat stream, you can feel free to start making those connections now. Thank you very much again for joining us, and until we connect again.